Every tradition that has ever tried to explain why this world feels broken has landed on the same answer. Something came down from above. Something intervened. The church calls them fallen angels. The Enochian scribes called them watchers. The Gnostics, when they inherited that same story and pushed it further than anyone had dared, called them something else entirely, and what they found underneath the surface of that myth was not a cautionary tale about divine punishment. It was a record of what happened before the Archons existed, before the prison was built, before the material world was declared finished and sealed. There is a version of this story that predates every institution that has ever tried to contain it. It is older than the church, older than the canon, and it begins not with a fall but with a descent that was chosen. That is what this video is about. Let's begin with what the texts actually say. Most people encounter the Watchers through a single verse. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. The sons of God saw the daughters of men and found them beautiful, took them as wives, and produced the Nephilim, the giants, the mighty men, the men of renown. That is the entire canonical account. 4 verses. After that, the flood comes, and the Watchers are never mentioned again in the Hebrew Bible by name. But that 4-verse fragment is not the beginning of the story. It is the compressed remnant of a much older, far more elaborate tradition. And the text that preserves that tradition in full is the Book of Enoch. The first Book of Enoch, also called 1 Enoch, or Ethiopic Enoch, is one of the most important religious documents ever written. It is not in the Protestant Bible. It is not in the Catholic canon. It was excluded. But for centuries before that exclusion, it was treated as scripture. The early church fathers quoted it. The authors of the New Testament quoted it. The Epistle of Jude, which is in your Bible right now, quotes 1 Enoch almost word for word. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth, has never removed it from its canon. It remains scripture there today. Scholars date the earliest sections of 1 Enoch, particularly the Book of the Watchers, which comprises chapters 1 through 36, to somewhere between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE. These are not late additions. These are not medieval interpolations. This is a pre-Christian Jewish text describing, in granular detail, exactly what the Watchers were, what they did, why they did it, and what the consequences were. And those consequences did not simply end with a flood. The Book of the Watchers opens with a vision. Enoch, the 7th patriarch, a man who, according to Genesis, walked with God and never died, he was simply taken, receives a revelation about what is coming to the earth. The language is not ambiguous. 200 Watchers, the text says, descended to a place called Mount Hermon. The text gives us the name of the mountain. It gives us the number. It gives us their leader's name, Shemihaza, and it tells us something that the Genesis account omits entirely. They made an oath. This is not a spontaneous corruption. This is not a moment of weakness, where divine beings simply could not resist human beauty. The Watchers gathered, they deliberated, and they swore a collective oath to descend together and take wives from among the daughters of men. The text is explicit. They feared that if they did this individually, each one would bear the sin alone and turn back. The oath was designed to make them collectively accountable, every single one of them, bound together in the decision. That detail changes everything about how this story functions. An accidental fall is one kind of story. A deliberate, coordinated, sworn descent that is a completely different kind of story. One raises questions about temptation and weakness. The other raises questions about purpose, about intention, about what, exactly, these beings were trying to do. The Gnostic texts, written centuries later, would push that question further than the Enochian tradition ever did. But to understand what the Gnostics made of the Watchers, you first have to understand what the Watchers actually brought down with them, because it was not just transgression, it was knowledge. The Book of the Watchers provides an itemized list. Shemihaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, the manipulation of natural forces through ritual and botanical knowledge. Amaros taught the resolving of enchantments, how to break what had been bound. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the signs of the stars. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the signs of the moon. And then there is Azazel. Azazel taught men how to make swords, how to make shields, how to make breastplates. He taught women the art of ornamentation, precious metals, the working of antimony, cosmetics, the beautifying of the body. and a separate Enochian tradition, preserved in a text called 2 Enoch, and in later Gnostic commentary, suggests Azazel's transmission went deeper still, that he taught the distortion of perception itself, the making of appearances that do not correspond to reality. The archangels Michael, Uriel, Raphael, Gabriel observe what is happening on earth, and they bring a petition to God. Their description of the damage is worth pausing on. The text says the earth cried out. The souls of those who had been destroyed called from the ground. The corruption had become total. But notice what God does not do immediately. He does not simply destroy the watchers. He instructs the archangels to bind them first, to imprison them, to hold them until the judgment. That detail, the binding, the imprisonment, the holding, will become one of the most important structural elements in later Gnostic cosmology. The imprisoned divine being who still exercises influence from within the prison is not an Archon. Not yet. But the architecture is already being built. Here is a question the Church never wanted you to sit with. If the knowledge the Watchers transmitted was purely destructive, if weapons and cosmetics and astrology and root-cutting were simply tools of corruption with no other value, why did those traditions survive? Why did every ancient civilization that emerged after the supposed flood period carry some version of this transmitted knowledge? Why do we have astrology, metallurgy, herbal medicine, and astronomical observation embedded in the foundations of every major ancient culture on Earth? The official answer is that these things survived because they are natural human developments. Cultures discover metallurgy independently. Civilizations develop astronomy from observation. The Watcher narrative is mythology, not history. But that answer ignores what the mythology is actually doing. The Enochian tradition does not frame the knowledge the Watchers transmitted as evil in itself. It frames the transmission as premature, untimely, given to beings who were not ready for it. Raphael is instructed to bind Azazel and cast him into a pit in the desert, a place called Dudael, and to cover him with rough and jagged rocks and darkness until the day of judgment. The text then says, and this phrasing is precise, ascribe all sin to him. Azazel becomes the repository of guilt, the one onto whom the full weight of corruption is transferred. This is a scapegoat mechanism. Students of ancient Near Eastern religion will recognize it immediately. The Hebrew scapegoat ritual described in Leviticus 16, where a goat is symbolically loaded with the sins of the community and sent into the wilderness to Azazel, carries the same name, the same figure, the same desert. The scapegoat in Leviticus is sent to Azazel, not away from him. It is sent back. That ritual connection between Leviticus and 1 Enoch is not a coincidence. It is a trace of a much older theological argument, one that the final editors of the Hebrew canon tried to obscure by stripping the Watcher narrative down to 4 verses and leaving Azazel's name in Leviticus without explanation. The argument being obscured is this: Azazel is not simply a tempter. Azazel is a bearer. What he carries is the knowledge that was given too early, to creatures who were not yet capable of handling it without destroying themselves. And the question that argument opens is one the Gnostics would later develop into an entire cosmological system. Who decided humanity was not ready? Who set the threshold? Who benefits from a humanity kept in ignorance? Let that question sit for a moment. We will return to it. First, let's look at what Azazel's teaching actually produced at the ground level, because the texts are specific, in a way most modern summaries fail to preserve. The Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and human women, are described in 1 Enoch as consuming everything. First, they ate all the food that human beings could produce. Then they turned on the animals. Then they turned on each other. Then, in a passage that has no parallel in the Genesis account, they began to devour human flesh. And when they died, when the giants died, because they were mortal despite their hybrid origin, their spirits did not go where human spirits go. They remained. They remained on the earth as disembodied forces, unclean spirits. The text is explicit about this. The spirits of the Nephilim became the evil spirits that afflict humanity, not demons from hell, not fallen angels. The specific, disembodied remnants of beings who were born from a forbidden crossing. This is a crucial distinction that gets lost in almost every popular account of this material. The Watchers are not demons. The Nephilim are not demons. What the Nephilim become after death, those disembodied, earthbound, afflicting forces, those are what the Enochian tradition calls evil spirits. And the later Gnostic tradition, when it encounters this framework, does something remarkable with it. It asks, what is the relationship between these earthbound remnant spirits and the cosmic forces, the Archons, that govern the material world from above. Are they the same category? Are they in communication? Is the affliction from below connected to the administration from above? The Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century BCE text that also preserves and elaborates on the Watcher narrative, adds a detail that moves the story closer to what the Gnostics would eventually construct. When God prepares to bind all the Nephilim spirits and remove them from the earth, the leader of those spirits, a figure named Mastema, which translates roughly as hostility or enmity, petitions God to allow 1/10 of them to remain, to continue afflicting humanity, to serve as instruments of testing and punishment, and God agrees. This is not a minor point. The authorized retention of afflicting spirits authorized by the highest divine authority in the text is a theological claim with enormous implications. It means the affliction is not simply corruption that leaked through a crack. It is, at least in part, sanctioned, permitted, built into the structure. The Gnostics read that passage and they did not smooth over its implications, they amplified them. Because if affliction is authorized from above, then the question is not how to defeat the affliction. The question is who issued the authorization, and whether that being is actually the highest authority in the cosmos, or merely the highest authority this particular system of reality was built to serve. The Book of the Watchers names Mount Hermon as the site of descent. This is not an incidental geographical detail. Mount Hermon sits at the northern edge of ancient Canaan, on the border of what is now Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. It is one of the highest peaks in the entire region, over 9,000 feet, and in antiquity, it was understood as a place where the divine and the human worlds made contact. The name Hermon itself is connected to a Semitic root, meaning devoted, or under a ban, or consecrated by oath. The same root that gives us the Hebrew concept of herem, a thing placed under divine prohibition, set apart, destroyed as a sacred act. The Watchers chose this mountain. The text does not say God directed them there. It says they swore their oath on that mountain by choice. They selected a site that was already associated with the crossing of boundaries, with things set apart and under ban, with the liminal space between divine and human domains, and they used it as the ground point of their collective commitment. This is the kind of detail that separates the Enochian tradition from simple mythological morality tale. A morality tale does not need to name the mountain. It does not need to specify the oath-taking mechanism. The naming serves a different function. It maps the event. It grounds it in a specific place with a specific resonance, so that anyone with access to the wider tradition of what Hermon means, the herem concept, the consecrated prohibition, can decode the additional layer of meaning. What the Watchers were doing at Hermon was not simply breaking a rule. They were performing a ritual inversion, taking the very place associated with sacred prohibition and using it as the site of a deliberately chosen transgression. This is not impulsive. This is not accidental. This is a sophisticated, intentional act by beings who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly what it meant. The Gnostic reading of this passage, particularly as it develops in texts like the Apocryphon of John and in later Sethian materials, is that this level of intention implies a level of knowledge that simple divine servants would not possess. The Watchers knew about Hiram. They knew what Hermon meant. They chose it specifically, which means they were not merely messengers who overstepped. They were beings with genuine cosmological understanding who made a specific choice about where to anchor their action in the structure of reality. Now hold that alongside the Gnostic framework for a moment. In Sethian Gnosticism, the tradition that produced the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Hypostasis of the Archons, and several other Nag Hammadi texts, there is a category of divine beings who descend into the material world, not because they fell, not because they were corrupted, but because they chose to be present in the lower realm for a specific purpose. These are not the Archons. The Archons are the builders and administrators of the material prison. These descending beings are different. They come from the pleroma, the fullness, and they enter the lower world with intention, sometimes to illuminate, sometimes to transmit, sometimes to serve as the hidden presence of a higher reality inside a world that has forgotten that reality exists. The Gnostic Watchers, when the tradition picks up the Enochian narrative and reframes it, are not simply fallen angels who wanted human women. They are, in at least one significant strand of the tradition, emissaries, beings who descended with a transmission. And the reason that transmission caused chaos was not because knowledge is inherently corrupting, but because the material world, administered by the Archons, was specifically constructed to prevent that transmission from reaching human beings. The chaos was not the failure of the mission. The chaos was the Archonic response to the mission. This reframing does not appear in the Book of Enoch. The Enochian tradition, rooted in Second Temple Judaism, maintains a clear moral hierarchy. The Watchers transgressed, caused destruction, were bound and punished, and the flood came to cleanse the damage. That is the official version. But within that official version, there are seams. There are places where the material does not quite cohere within the morality tale framework. The detail of the oath, the geography of Hermon, the itemized list of transmitted knowledge that covers not just weapons but astronomy, agricultural cycles, understanding of natural signs. The survival of that knowledge in every subsequent human civilization. The Gnostics found those seams, and they pulled on them. Before we move into what the Gnostics specifically made of this tradition, and we are going to go deep into that, into the Apocryphon of John's treatment of the celestial realm before the Archons, into the hypostasis of the Archons' description of the Watchers in direct relation to the Archonic structure, into the way the Gospel of the Egyptians preserves a version of the Watcher myth that places it before the creation of the material world rather than inside it before all of that. I want to anchor one more element of the Enochian framework that everything else depends on. The imprisonment of Shemihaza and the other leaders among the Watchers is described in 1 Enoch in a specific way. They are not destroyed. They are bound. They are placed in a valley, covered, held under the earth, and told to wait for the final judgment. Their punishment is not annihilation, it is suspension. And in that suspension, they are still present, still exerting some form of influence, bound, but not gone. The Gnostics would later describe the Archons in almost identical terms as beings who govern a realm that is itself a kind of prison, who are themselves in some sense trapped within the system they administer, unable to perceive the higher reality that exists above them. The structural parallel is not accidental. The Gnostics were reading the Enochian texts. They were reading them carefully, and they were asking, what if the imprisonment described here is not just a punishment story? What if it is a description of the fundamental condition of every being caught inside the material world? That question, what if the imprisonment described here is not just a punishment story, is the question that unlocks everything else the Enochian tradition is trying to tell you. Because once you ask it seriously, you stop reading the Book of Enoch as ancient mythology and you start reading it as a cosmological map. And the first thing a cosmological map requires is specificity. Not just that something went wrong, but what, exactly, went wrong, and how, and why it could not simply be undone. The transgression of the Watchers is described in precise terms. This is not vague moral failing. The text is anatomically specific about what occurred and why it constituted a rupture in the structure of reality itself. There were 200 of them. The number is not incidental. 200 is a deliberate enumeration. The text wants you to understand that this was not the act of a single rogue being, but a collective decision made among a group of considerable size, a group that had apparently deliberated, organized, and committed to a course of action together. The leader of this group is named Shemihaza, and the text records that before the descent occurred, Shemihaza expressed something that most readers overlook entirely. He expressed doubt. He told the others that he was afraid that he alone would bear the full weight of the sin if the rest of them lost their nerve and withdrew. So the group made a pact. They swore an oath, binding themselves collectively to the act they were about to perform. The oath is what makes this a covenant, not just a crime. And in the ancient cosmological imagination, a covenant entered into under an oath has binding metaphysical weight. It creates a structure that persists. Then, they descended. The specific location the text names is Mount Hermon, a mountain that sits at the junction of what is now Lebanon, Syria, and northern Israel. The name Hermon itself carries an embedded meaning that the Enochian scribes were clearly aware of. It derives from a root that carries connotations of consecration and binding, of being devoted to something in a way that cannot be easily reversed. The mountain of their descent is named for the act of binding that made the descent possible. What they did once they reached the earth is described in 3 distinct movements, and it is important to understand all 3 as a unified sequence rather than as separate events. The first movement was the taking of human wives. The text is not coy about this. The sons of God, the Watchers, the Iron, whatever name they carry in whichever layer of the tradition you are reading, they saw the daughters of men, and they found them beautiful, and they took them as wives, and they had children with them. The children born from these unions were the Nephilim, a word typically translated as giants. Though the root of the word carries connotations of those who have fallen, or those who cause others to fall. These beings were described as enormous in stature, consuming resources at a rate that the Earth and its human inhabitants could not sustain, eventually turning on humanity itself, and then on each other. The Nephilim are not simply large humans. They are what happens when a divine order of being crosses into a domain where it does not belong and produces offspring that belong to neither world completely. They are hybrid creatures, caught between categories. And in the cosmological imagination of the ancient world, a being that belongs to no stable category is dangerous in ways that go beyond the physical. It is an ontological disruption. The second movement was the transmission of forbidden knowledge. This is the piece that tends to get minimized in popular treatments of the Watcher story. But the text spends considerable time on it, naming specific Watchers, specific domains of knowledge, and specific human recipients. Azazel taught the making of weapons, swords, shields, and armor, and the working of metals. He taught women the arts of ornamentation, cosmetics, and adornment. Other Watchers taught the reading of celestial signs, the knowledge of cloud formations and root cutting, the interpretation of omens, astrology in its early forms, and techniques of sorcery. The list in the text reads like a taxonomy of the arts that separate civilization from raw nature. This is not random. The Watchers are not simply sharing party tricks. They are transferring knowledge that accelerates certain human capacities, while simultaneously severing the natural relationship between humanity and the divine ordering of things. The third movement is the consequence that no one in the story chose, but that everyone in the story produced together: irreversible contamination. The earth itself, the text says, was filled with iniquity, not just with bad behavior, with a kind of structural wrongness that permeated the fabric of created reality. This is the moment the Gnostics would later return to, again and again, when they tried to explain why the material world feels the way it feels. Most people, when they encounter the Watcher story, fixate on the sexual transgression, the sons of God, the daughters of men, the monstrous hybrid offspring. It is the part of the story that feels most dramatic, most viscerally wrong, in the way ancient taboo violations feel wrong. And that fixation is understandable. But it is also, in a precise sense, a misreading of where the text places its deepest alarm. The sexual transgression is presented as a boundary violation, a crossing of categories that should not be crossed. But the knowledge transmission, the teaching of specific arts and sciences and techniques to human beings who were not prepared to receive them, is presented as something structurally different. It is presented as a corruption of the process by which knowledge itself moves through reality. Consider what the text is actually describing when it names the specific knowledge domains transmitted by specific Watchers: Azazel and the metallurgical arts, the knowledge of how to extract metal from the earth and shape it into weapons. Prior to this transmission, the text implies human beings did not have this knowledge in the form that would generate the scale of violence that followed. The introduction of organized warfare, of weaponized metal, is traced not to human ingenuity, but to a deliberate teaching from a being who had no right to accelerate human capacity in that direction. Ornamentation, cosmetics, the arts of self-presentation that the text associates with seduction and vanity. Again, this is not simple moralism. The deeper concern is that these arts create a particular relationship to appearance, to the surface of things, to the material realm, as something to be manipulated for effect. In the cosmological framework, the Enochian texts are working within. Anything that deepens attachment to material appearance deepens the entrapment of consciousness in the material world. Astrology, the reading of celestial signs, the interpretation of omens. This one is the most counterintuitive. We might expect the transmission of celestial knowledge to be celebrated rather than condemned, but the text regards it as a crime, and the reason it regards it as a crime is revealing. In the cosmological understanding, embedded in the Enochian tradition, the stars and the movements of celestial bodies were themselves a kind of divine language, a communication from the higher order to the lower, readable by those who had been properly authorized to read it. When the Watchers transmitted astrological knowledge to human beings outside of that proper authorization process, they did not simply share information, they introduced the possibility of misreading the divine language, of interpreting celestial signs through a lens of desire, of manipulation, of using the language of the cosmos as a tool for control rather than as a channel for genuine orientation. Every occult practice subsequently derived from this unauthorized transmission carries, in the Enochian view, a structural flaw. It operates with real information fed through a corrupted interpretive channel. The Watchers, who transmitted root-cutting knowledge, the arts of herbal knowledge and their applications, were doing something similar in the domain of the natural world. Not sharing information about how plants work, but sharing a way of relating to the natural world as a repository of powers to be extracted and weaponized, rather than as a living system to be participated in. What all of these transmissions share is a single underlying structure. They all involve taking something that belongs to a higher order of being and deploying it within a lower order, without the mediation that would make that deployment safe. It is not that the knowledge itself is intrinsically evil. It is that knowledge separated from the proper relational context in which it was meant to operate becomes something different in kind. It becomes power without wisdom, capacity without orientation, the ability to act without the understanding of what one is acting within. This is the deeper crime, and the Gnostics understood it as such. When they later developed their account of the Archons and the kind of world the Archons administer, they were reaching back to precisely this structure. The Archons, in the Gnostic cosmological framework, govern a world that was itself constructed through a similar act of unauthorized deployment, a lower being attempting to do what only a higher being has the relational capacity to do, producing a world that has the appearance of order but lacks the animating principle that would make it genuinely alive. The Watcher transmissions are, in this reading, a microcosm of the Demiurge's own fundamental error. Both involve taking what belongs to a higher register of reality and forcing it into a lower one. Both produce effects that look like creation or illumination, but function as entrapment. This is where Enoch himself enters the story. And it is important to be precise about who Enoch is within this tradition, because the popular imagination tends to flatten him into either a prophet or a mystic, and he is neither of those things in the full sense that the Enochian literature presents him. Enoch is the 7th generation from Adam. The text of Genesis gives him exactly 3 verses, but within those 3 verses, it records something extraordinary, and does so without elaboration, as if the compiler of Genesis found it necessary to include, but was not certain what to do with it. Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. He did not die. Every other patriarch in the genealogical list of Genesis dies. Their deaths are recorded. Enoch's death is not recorded because, the text implies, he did not die in the conventional sense. He was taken. He was translated, moved from one state or one domain of existence to another without passing through death. The Enochian literature is the tradition that develops around the question of what that translation involved and what Enoch experienced and was given during it. And what it describes is not simply a mystical journey. It is a commission. Enoch is given a specific task at a moment of cosmic crisis, and the task is this: he is sent as a messenger, not upward to God, but downward, to the Watchers. He is the one who must carry the divine verdict to beings who were, before their descent, his ontological superiors. A human being, a created, embodied, mortal being, is selected as the vehicle through which the judgment of the highest order of reality is communicated to beings who occupy a higher metaphysical rank than he does. The reversal is deliberate, and the text wants you to feel its full weight. The Watchers did not value what they were. They abandoned their proper station in pursuit of something beneath them. And so the message of their condemnation comes to them through precisely the category of being they degraded themselves to pursue. What Enoch sees on his journey is the substance of the books that bear his name. And what he sees is not simply a vision of divine glory. It is a tour of the cosmological architecture, the structure of the heavens, the nature of the judgment systems that operate within created reality, the storehouses of meteorological and celestial phenomena, the place where the souls of the dead reside, the place where the bound Watchers are held. He is shown the mechanisms of reality from the inside, not from below, as a human being struggling to understand a world that exceeds him, but from a position of guided observation, with celestial beings as his interpreters. The figure who guides Enoch through this tour is named in some versions of the text as Uriel, one of the archangels, a being whose name means something in the vicinity of fire of God or light of God, depending on which root you emphasize. Uriel's role is not simply to show Enoch beautiful things. His role is to explain the mechanisms that govern the cosmos, why the stars move as they do, what the celestial bodies are and what they are for, what the judgment of the Watchers consists of, and why it takes the form it takes. Enoch is being educated in cosmological literacy, not for his own benefit alone, but so that he can carry this knowledge back and, more importantly, transmit it forward into the tradition that will eventually become the Enochian literature, into the hands of readers across centuries, who will use it as the framework through which they understand the nature of the world they inhabit. Here is what I find genuinely striking about this structure, and I want to be direct about it. The Enochian tradition solves a problem that most religious traditions leave unresolved. The problem is this: if the cosmos is governed by a just and competent highest principle, why does the world look the way it looks? Why is there violence, corruption, the exploitation of the innocent, the apparent victory of the brutal over the gentle? Most traditions answer this question with appeals to mystery, with promises of future rectification, with explanations that require you to accept that justice operates on a timescale too vast for human comprehension. The Enochian tradition does something different. It says, look, here is the specific mechanism by which the disruption occurred. Here are the specific beings responsible. Here is the specific form of the judgment that has been rendered against them. Here is why the effects you see in the world around you persist despite that judgment. It is not mystery. It is a broken system that has been identified, diagnosed, and sentenced, but whose sentence has not yet been fully executed. The world is not opaque. It is intelligible. And the Enochian literature is presenting itself as the instrument of that intelligibility. The judgment rendered against the Watchers is not simple. It is not a verdict followed by an execution. It is a structured, phased response to a structured, phased transgression, and the architecture of that judgment tells you as much about how this cosmological tradition understands reality as the transgression itself does. The first element of the judgment is binding. The Watchers are bound physically, metaphysically, in ways the text describes in specific spatial and material terms. They are placed beneath the hills, beneath the valleys of the earth, in a place of darkness, in a place sealed against both their escape and against the perception of the world above. The binding is not execution. This is crucial. The text is careful to distinguish between the state of being bound, neutralized, imprisoned, prevented from further direct action, and the state of being finally judged, which is reserved for a later moment, described as the great day of judgment. Between the binding and the final judgment, there is an interval. The text calls this interval by different names in different sections, but the essential concept is consistent. It is a time of waiting, a suspended state, in which the consequences of the transgression are working themselves out in the world above, while the transgressors themselves can do nothing but remain in their confinement. The second element of the judgment is directed specifically at Azazel, who receives a more detailed and more personal condemnation than the others. The archangel Raphael is instructed to bind Azazel hand and foot, to cast him into darkness, to cover him with rough and jagged rocks, to leave him there in darkness, so that on the great day of judgment he will be led away to the fire. But there is an additional instruction embedded in Raphael's commission that is easy to miss if you are reading quickly. The earth is to be healed from the wound that Azazel has inflicted upon it. Raphael is instructed to announce the healing of the earth. The earth itself is a victim. The earth has been wounded by what was done through Azazel's teachings, by the introduction of weapons and warfare, and the arts of material entrapment. The healing of the earth is part of the judgment against Azazel, not incidental, central. The third element of the judgment involves the Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers and human women. They cannot be simply preserved or forgiven. They are not fully divine, and they cannot be returned to a purely divine state. They are not fully human, and they cannot simply live as humans live. They occupy a structural impossibility, and the judgment reflects that impossibility. They are to be destroyed, but not without consequence. From their destruction will emerge evil spirits that will afflict the earth until the final judgment. The spirits of the Nephilim become, in this tradition, the class of beings that later traditions will call demons, not fallen angels, which is a separate category, but the disembodied remnant of hybrid beings who should never have existed, whose very existence constitutes a category error, and whose continued presence as spirits is the ongoing cost that the material world pays for the Watcher transgression. The Gnostics, when they later articulated their understanding of the Archons, were working with a tradition that already contained this architecture. The Archons are not simply evil beings who happen to govern the material world. They are beings who govern a world that is itself saturated with the residue of a prior transgression. They are administrators of a system that was already structurally compromised before they were involved with it. And this is a point the Gnostic texts make with some care. The Archons are not the original problem. They are a secondary expression of a problem that goes deeper. The original problem is the rupture in the fabric of created reality, the moment when a lower order of consciousness attempted to operate in a register that exceeded its proper domain and produced a world that carries that excess as a permanent structural wound. The Watcher story, in the Enochian tradition, is the first and most vivid account of how that rupture happens at the level of created beings within history. The Sophia myth in the Gnostic tradition describes how a comparable rupture happens at the level of cosmological origination at the moment of the world's creation, rather than within the world's history. But both stories are describing the same underlying mechanism. A being reaches beyond its proper domain. The reaching produces a rupture. The rupture produces a world or a condition within the world that carries the character of that rupture as its defining feature. And the beings who inhabit that world are left to navigate a system that is not simply difficult but is structurally oriented away from the highest reality, pointing in the wrong direction at the level of its foundational architecture. This is not abstract theology. This is the explanation for the specific texture of the world you actually inhabit. The Gnostics understood this. The Enochian scribes understood it before them. And the connection between the two traditions is not interpretive speculation, it is documented, traceable, and precise. The Book of Enoch is not a minor text. It is not a footnote in the history of religious literature. For centuries, it was treated as scripture cited by New Testament authors, carried by early Christian communities, preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon to this day. Then it was systematically excluded, not because scholars determined it was late or unreliable, because what it described could not be reconciled with the institutional theology that was hardening around the figure of God as singular sovereign, all-good, all-powerful, unchallenged. What it described was a descent. The text calls them the Watchers. The Hebrew term is irin, those who watch, those who are awake, those who observe. They are not demons in the original framing. They are not creatures of darkness or agents of chaos who exist in opposition to a good God. They are a class of beings situated at a particular level of the cosmic hierarchy, assigned a specific function, to observe humanity from above, to maintain a threshold of separation between the higher realm and the lower one. The boundary was not punitive. The boundary was structural. It preserved the integrity of both realms by preventing a certain kind of mixing that the architecture of existence was not designed to accommodate. And then 200 of them chose to cross it anyway. The first book of Enoch, in chapters 6 through 11 sections, that scholars date to approximately the 3rd century BCE, though the traditions they encode are almost certainly older records. The decision of a cohort of watchers under the leadership of a figure named Semyaza. This is not a spontaneous corruption. The text is explicit. They deliberated. They understood what they were proposing to do. Semyaza himself expressed concern that the others would lose their resolve, and he would bear the transgression alone. So they swore an oath collectively, binding themselves to a shared course of action. They descended onto Mount Hermon. The name of the mountain is given with precision in the text, and the name itself encodes the act. Hermon derives from the Hebrew root for ban or prohibition, sherem. They landed on the mountain of the forbidden thing. What they wanted was the daughters of humanity. This is how the text frames it. They saw human women and desired them. They took wives from among them. They produced offspring. Read it literally, and it is a strange mythological account of supernatural beings interbreeding with humans. But the cosmological tradition that surrounds this account, and the Gnostic materials that explicitly reference and build upon it, points towards something more structurally significant than a story about desire and transgression. The Watchers were beings who existed at a level of reality closer to the source than the material world. They possessed knowledge. The text uses the word in its deepest sense of the underlying structure of things. When they crossed the boundary and entered into direct union with material existence, they did not simply produce children. They transferred something. They brought knowledge downward into a domain that was not equipped to receive it without distortion. The Enochian text catalogues exactly what each Watcher taught. Semyaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Amaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the knowledge of the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Sariel taught the course of the moon. And Azazel, who occupies a position of special prominence in the text, sometimes appearing as co-leader with Semyaza, sometimes superseding him entirely. Azazel taught something more dangerous than any celestial science. Azazel taught the fabrication of weapons and the art of war. He taught metalworking, the crafting of ornaments, the technologies of beautification and seduction. The text treats these as equivalent transgressions, the blade and the cosmetic produced by the same act of misplaced disclosure. This detail matters enormously. The The transgression is not simply that divine beings had children with human women. The transgression is that a higher order of knowledge was introduced into a system that would immediately weaponize it, not because humans are evil, but because the material realm operates under conditions, scarcity, competition, mortality, fear that transform every tool into a potential instrument of domination. Knowledge of metallurgy in a world of unlimited resources is craft. Knowledge of metallurgy in a world of horseshoety and tribal competition is conquest. The Watchers did not create human violence. They handed a burning coal to beings living in a world made of dry grass. The consequences are described with extraordinary specificity. Giants were born the Nephilim, called in some manuscripts the Gibborim, beings of immense physical power, who consumed the resources of the earth and then turned on humanity itself. The earth cried out. The text says this literally. The cry of those being destroyed by the giants ascended to heaven, and 4 archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, Gabriel, looked down and saw what had been set in motion. Here is what the mainstream tradition does with this material. It reads the descent of the Watchers as a morality tale about lust and disobedience. Divine beings were supposed to stay in their lane. They didn't. They were punished. End of story. The takeaway is obedience. Stay in your place. Do not reach beyond what you are authorized to reach for. God is in control. The fall was an aberration, and the corrective is submission to proper authority. This is not what the text says. It is what the text was made to say by a theological tradition that needed every story to end with the same lesson. What the text actually describes is a structural event with structural consequences. The Watchers did not simply sin. They collapsed a boundary that existed for cosmological reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with arbitrary prohibition and everything to do with the compatibility between different orders of reality. The knowledge they carried was not dangerous because it was forbidden in the sense of divinely arbitrary restriction. It was dangerous because the level of reality into which it was introduced could not metabolize it without catastrophic distortion. Think about what this means precisely. The Watchers occupied a position between the highest reality and the material world. They were, in the language the later Gnostic texts would develop with great precision, intermediate beings neither fully of the pleroma nor fully embedded in matter. Their function was to hold a particular boundary in a particular way. When they abandoned that function, the boundary did not simply fall, it inverted. What had been a threshold became a wound. What had been a maintained separation became a point of uncontrolled mixing. The offspring of this mixing, the Nephilim, are not simply unusually large humans. In the cosmological reading, they are the literal incarnation of that wound. They are what happens when 2 incompatible orders of being fuse without the architecture to contain the result. They are not evil in any simple moral sense. They are structurally wrong. Their very existence represents a kind of ontological error, beings who do not fit within the design of either realm, too material to access the higher reality, too influenced by the Watcher's knowledge to be fully integrated into the natural order of earthly life. And crucially, this matters enormously for what follows. They do not just destroy through violence, they destroy through consumption. The Enochian text says they ate everything. They consumed the labor of humanity, then the animals, then each other. This is not incidental narrative detail. This is a description of a system operating under conditions of infinite appetite with finite resources. It is the defining feature of a world in which the normal regulatory mechanisms, the restraints that prevent any single force from consuming everything, have been overwhelmed. The Gnostic tradition, when it picks up this thread, will connect it to something even more foundational, the nature of the Demiurge and the Archons, as systems that operate on exactly this principle. Infinite appetite, structural inability to be satisfied, a fundamental incapacity for the kind of self-limitation that characterizes beings in right relationship to the source. The Nephilim are not just the children of the Watchers. They are the first historical instantiation of the archonic principle operating in embodied form. Now consider the divine response. The 4 archangels see what is happening and appeal to the highest authority. The Enochian text records their appeal verbatim, and it is one of the most remarkable passages in the entire literature. They describe a world, drowning in iniquity, in which the souls of the dead cry out, and their voice reaches to the gates of heaven, in which the whole earth is filled with the blood and lawlessness taught by Azazel. Then they ask, what shall we do with them? The answer that comes back is precise. Raphael is sent to bind Azazel, specifically to bind him, to cast him into darkness, to cover his face so that he cannot see the light. to keep him there until the day of judgment. The punishment is not destruction, it is confinement, it is blindness. The being who taught humanity to see certain things, metalwork, weaponry, the technologies of material manipulation, is himself deprived of sight and sealed into the earth. Gabriel is sent to the children of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and instructed to send them against each other, not to destroy them directly, but to create the conditions under which they destroy themselves. And Michael is sent to bind Semyaza and the remaining Watchers in the valleys of the earth until the final judgment. The mechanism matters. The correction does not undo the original transgression. It does not restore the previous state. It contains the damage within a defined structure. It is remediation, not restoration. The world that exists after the intervention of the archangels is not the world that existed before the Watchers descended. It is a world that has been permanently altered, and the best that can be done is to manage the consequences of that alteration until a more fundamental resolution is available. This is the template. Everything that follows in both the Enochian and the Gnostic tradition is working within this template. Of all the 200 Watchers, Azazel receives the most sustained and specific attention in the Enochian literature. This is not accidental. The text treats his transgression as categorically different from the others, not just in degree, but in kind. Semyaza's sin was primarily one of desire and governance. He led the group, he organized the descent. He bears the title of chief among those who chose to cross the boundary. But Azazel's sin is epistemic. He is the one who changed the relationship between humanity and knowledge itself. The first book of Enoch says, directly, all the earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. This is a remarkable statement, not to Semyaza, the leader, not to the collective action of 200 beings, to Azazel specifically, because of what he taught. What did he teach? The text gives a precise inventory: the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, the working of metals, the use of antimony, a metallurgical substance used in ancient craftsmanship, the making of bracelets, ornaments, the use of eyeshadow, the beautification of eyelids, the stones of value, all kinds of colored dyes. And the children of men learned the mysteries, and in the time of the giants they became wicked because of this knowledge. Read this inventory carefully. It is not a random list. Weapons and ornamentation, warfare and beautification, the technologies of violence and the technologies of seduction. The Enochian text treats these as fundamentally the same category of transgression because they operate through the same mechanism. They are both technologies of manipulation, of power over others, of achieving effects in the material world that exceed what natural embodied existence would otherwise make available. Before Azazel's teaching, a human being had the capabilities of a human being. After it, human beings had access to techniques that functioned as force multipliers, amplifying individual will and desire beyond the natural scale at which the material world was structured to operate. The blade does not replace the fist. It multiplies the fist by a factor that changes the nature of what conflict is. The ornament does not replace natural appearance. It multiplies the power of appearance in ways that distort the natural social dynamics around attraction and alliance. Both technologies produce the same structural effect. They allow the will of one being to operate at scales that overwhelm the natural equilibrium of the system. And this is precisely what the Gnostic tradition will identify as the defining characteristic of the Archons, not evil in the conventional sense of intentional malice. Overreach, disproportionate reach, the imposition of one force on a system in ways the system was not designed to accommodate. Azazel teaches humanity to be archonic before the Archons, as the Gnostic texts describe them, are fully elaborated as a cosmological category. Now, consider the specific punishment assigned to him. Raphael is instructed to bind Azazel hand and foot and throw him into the darkness, into a desert place called Dudale, and to cast rough and jagged rocks upon him and cover him with darkness. He is to remain there, with his face covered, unseeing, until the great day of judgment, when he shall be cast into the fire. The symmetry is exact and deliberate. The being who gave sight, who opened the eyes of humanity to the technologies of domination, is himself blinded. The being who taught the making of weapons and ornaments is buried under raw, unworked stone, the very material that metallurgy transforms. The punishment does not simply remove him. It inverts his transgression. He is made to experience, in his own body, the condition he imposed on the world, a kind of radical diminishment, a being of light sealed into darkness, forced into a state structurally analogous to the one the spark of divine consciousness experiences when trapped in matter. This parallel is not coincidental. The Gnostic texts will develop it explicitly. The trapped divine spark within the human being and the bound watcher within the earth occupy structurally equivalent positions. Both are higher-order consciousness, confined within material conditions that do not reflect their nature. Both are awaiting a resolution that the current state of the world cannot provide. Both exist as evidence of a rupture that has not yet been healed. There is a third element of Azazel's significance that is less frequently discussed, but is critical to the full picture. Several Enochian manuscripts place Azazel in a genealogical and functional relationship to a specific class of beings that the text calls the Satans, not a singular adversarial figure, but a category of being whose function is accusation, obstruction, and the testing of souls. The connection between Azazel and this class of beings is important because it positions him not merely as a transgressor, but as the originator of a specific kind of cosmic function, the function of the entity that operates as an adversary within the material system, not because it hates what it opposes, but because opposition is the role it was made or condemned to play. This is the template for the Archon, as the Gnostics will define it, a being that functions as an obstructing force, not through malice, but through the nature of what it is and what position it occupies in the structure of the fallen cosmos. The Archons are not trying to destroy you. They are doing what beings of their kind do. Azazel, in the Enochian framework, is where that category of being first becomes legible. The story does not end with the binding of Azazel and the imprisonment of Semyaza's cohort. This is the part of the Enochian account that most retellings omit, because it is the part that reveals the incompleteness of the divine response, and the incompleteness matters enormously for everything the Gnostic tradition will subsequently build. The Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watchers and human women, were destroyed. The flood in the Enochian account, the global inundation, is explicitly connected to the cleansing of what the Watchers' transgression had produced, removed them from the face of the earth. God looked at the world they had corrupted and determined that the biological continuity of the corrupted lineage needed to be broken. The Nephilim died in the flood, but their spirits did not. First Book of Enoch, chapter 15. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, war, and cause destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but crave, and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men, and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. This is the passage that the mainstream tradition has almost entirely suppressed, because what it describes is a category of being that exists after the Nephilim's physical death and continues to operate within the material world. These spirits, the disembodied consciousness of beings who were themselves the product of a transgression against the boundaries of reality, do not depart when their bodies are destroyed. They remain. They have no proper home in the higher realms, because they were not generated from those realms in a normal way. They have no proper home in the material world, because their material bodies were destroyed. They exist in the interstice, bodiless, driven by the appetites of the embodied giants they once were craving, thirsting, afflicting, causing offense, but now without the physical mechanism that those appetites were designed to operate through. This is the origin, in the Enochian framework, of what later traditions would call demons, not fallen angels, not the Watchers themselves, the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim beings of mixed nature, neither fully divine nor fully human, whose violent and insatiable appetites now operate without a body to metabolize them, and who therefore impose those appetites on embodied humans, attaching to human consciousness and human physical processes as a substitute for the bodies they no longer have. Let that land for a moment. The entities the Gnostic tradition will later categorize as secondary Archons, the lower-order beings who enforce the prison structure of material existence at the level of individual human experience, have their genealogical antecedent in this category, the bodiless spirits of the Nephilim, beings structurally unable to transcend the material realm they were born into, structurally unable to find satisfaction within it, either existing in a state of permanent frustrated appetite that they express by attaching to human beings. The Gnostic texts do not invent this structure. They inherit it, systematize it, and embed it within a more comprehensive cosmological framework. But the seed is here, in the Enochian account, in this precise passage about what happened to the Nephilim after the flood destroyed their bodies. Now consider the fuller picture of what the flood actually accomplished. It removed the biological lineage of the Nephilim. It cleansed the surface of a world that had been overwhelmed by their violence and consumption. It gave humanity a restart at the level of the material world's population. But it did not remove the disembodied spirits. It did not undo the knowledge Azazel had transmitted. Noah's descendants still had access to metalworking, still had the knowledge of weapons and ornamentation. It did not heal the rupture in the boundary between the higher and lower realms that the Watcher's original descent had created. And it did not free the Watchers themselves, who remained bound in the earth awaiting a final judgment that the Enochian text positions as still future. The flood is a remediation, not a restoration. The same word applies here that applies to the Archangel's intervention. The structure of the problem, the rupture, the mixed order beings, the disembodied spirits, the transmitted dangerous knowledge, the broken boundary persisted through the flood. The world that emerged from the flood carried the same foundational damage as the world that preceded it, now operating with a smaller human population, temporarily cleansed of the most overtly destructive beings, but structurally identical at the level of its fundamental architecture. This is the world the Gnostic tradition is describing when it talks about the prison of matter, not a prison that was built by the demiurge in one discrete act of cosmic tyranny, a prison that was accumulated layer by layer, transgression by transgression, incomplete remediation by incomplete remediation, until the condition of material existence had become what it is. A system so deeply structured away from the source that most of the beings living within it cannot detect the source at all. The Watchers are the beginning of that layering process. They are the first recorded instance of a higher order boundary being violated in ways that permanently altered the conditions of the lower realm. Everything that follows the demiurge, the Archons, the soul trap, the systematic suppression of gnosis, everything the Gnostic tradition maps with such precision is downstream of this. Downstream of Mount Hermon. Downstream of 200 beings who swore an oath and descended. So let's talk about the Nephilim, because this is where most people who have heard fragments of this story get the picture wrong. The popular version, the one that circulates in documentary culture, in certain corners of alternative history, in the breathless interpretations that treat Genesis 6 as a literal alien invasion, reduces the Nephilim to a single image: giants. Physically enormous beings, half divine, half human, roaming the antediluvian earth. That image is not entirely wrong, but it is radically incomplete. The word itself tells you more than the image does. Nephilim. From the Hebrew root naphal, to fall, to descend, to come down. Not giants, not warriors, not sons of gods, fallers, those who descended. The name encodes the cosmological event, not just the physical appearance. The Nephilim are, etymologically, the product of the descent. They carry the violation in their name. The Book of Enoch, First Enoch, written in its earliest layers around the 3rd century BCE and preserved in full only in the Ethiopic tradition, describes the Nephilim with a specificity the canonical Genesis account deliberately omits. And this is a critical distinction. Genesis 6 gives you 4 verses. 4 verses to cover an event that First Enoch treats as requiring dozens of chapters. The compression in the canonical text is not accidental. Something was being managed. First Enoch tells you the Nephilim were enormous. It gives a figure of 300 cubits, approximately 450 feet, by modern reckoning. That number is almost certainly symbolic rather than literal, a cosmological marker for excess, for the monstrous overreach of hybrid existence. But the physical scale is secondary to what the text actually emphasizes. What First Enoch is really interested in is the appetite. The Nephilim, according to First Enoch, consumed everything. They ate the produce of human agriculture until the humans could not sustain them. Then they ate the humans themselves. Then, when nothing was left, they turned on each other and on the animal world. This is not a monster story in the conventional sense. This is a description of a system consuming itself, a world where the introduction of beings outside the appropriate boundary produces runaway consumption, exponential demand, a hunger that the created order cannot satisfy. The earth becomes a resource extraction site for creatures who should not exist within it. The Gnostic reading of this passage, preserved in fragmentary form, across several Nag Hammadi texts and reconstructed from Sethian cosmological writings, takes this even further. The Nephilim's hunger is not incidental. It is symptomatic. When a being exists at the intersection of 2 incompatible ontological levels, divine origin, material instantiation, what results is a structural incoherence at the center of that being's existence. They are neither fully of the pleroma, which they cannot access, nor fully of the material world, which cannot sustain them. They are ontologically homeless. And the behavior that First Enoch describes, the endless consumption, the inability to be satisfied, is the behavioral signature of ontological homelessness. This framework matters because it reframes the Nephilim not as villains in a morality tale but as consequences. They are not evil in the way a human choosing wrongdoing is evil. They are the structural outcome of a boundary violation. They did not choose to exist in an incoherent state. The Watchers chose to create them, and the Nephilim became the living proof that the choice was catastrophically wrong. There is a passage in First Enoch, in the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers, where the spirits of the Nephilim after their physical deaths in the flood are described as continuing to exist as disembodied entities. This is a direct quote from the Charles translation. "The spirits of the giants shall be like clouds, which shall oppress, corrupt, fall, contend, and bruise upon earth. They shall cause lamentation. No food shall they eat, and they shall be thirsty. They shall be concealed, and shall not rise up against the sons of men and against women, for they come forth during the days of slaughter and destruction." Read that carefully. The Nephilim do not die cleanly. Their spirits persist. They exist without bodies, unable to be satisfied, unable to rest, predatory by nature, because their nature was never coherent to begin with. The Gnostic tradition picks this thread up and runs with it in a direction that connects directly to what the Archons are. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim entities created by boundary violation, structurally incapable of satisfaction, operating below the threshold of human perception, are one of the earliest models in the textual tradition for what later Gnostic cosmology will systematize as the Archontic layer. The Watchers descended. The Nephilim were born. The Nephilim died. And their spirits remained. This is where the architecture of the trap begins to take shape. The transgression of the Watchers was not only biological, the sexual union with human women, the production of the Nephilim that is one axis of what happened at Mount Hermon. There is a second axis that the texts treat with equal gravity. In some passages, with greater gravity, the Watchers taught. First Enoch is meticulous about this. Each Watcher who descended is named, and alongside each name, the text records a specific domain of knowledge that Watcher transmitted to humanity. This is not incidental biographical detail. The structure of the list name, transgression, specific knowledge transferred is meant to tell you something about the nature of the crime. The knowledge transfer is as much a violation as the physical union. Perhaps more. Azazel taught metalworking, specifically the forging of weapons, swords, shields, the instruments of organized warfare. Before Azazel, First Enoch implies, humanity did not have the knowledge to kill at scale. Individual violence existed, but the systematic architecture of war metallurgy applied to destruction that was a transmission from a higher order of being to a lower one. The text treats this as a catastrophic gift, not because violence is the worst thing possible in the Gnostic framework, but because warfare at scale produces the kind of organized social hierarchy that requires control structures, that requires rulers, that requires the surrender of individual gnosis to collective obedience. Azazel does not just give humanity weapons, he gives humanity the conditions under which power consolidates. Semyaza, the leader, the one who organized the oath on the summit of Hermon, taught enchantments, root cutting, which the scholars read as pharmacological knowledge, the use of plants to alter consciousness, to bind or loose spiritual states. This knowledge sits in an interesting ambiguity in the text. In some readings, it is purely negative, a tool for manipulation. In the Gnostic interpretive tradition, the ambiguity is preserved. Consciousness-altering knowledge can open perception or close it, depending on the intention and the framework within which it is used. Semyaza's transmission is dangerous not because it is inherently evil, but because it is power without the cosmological grounding that would make it navigable. Other named Watchers transmitted astrology, the reading of celestial signs, which in the ancient world was inseparable from the belief that cosmic bodies governed human fate. The Gnostic critique of astrology is sophisticated and worth pausing on. It is not that the stars have no influence. In the Gnostic framework, the Archons, when they are elaborated in later texts, are frequently associated with planetary spheres, each Archon governing a layer of reality tied to a celestial body. The astrological knowledge the Watchers transmit is not false. It is true in the worst possible way. It maps the prison accurately. It tells you which layer of the Archontic system governs which aspect of material existence. And in telling you this, without telling you how to transcend it, it produces a different kind of trap, the trap of a map with no exit. The pattern, across the entire list of Watcher transmissions, is consistent. Every piece of knowledge transferred is real, functional, and in isolation, not obviously evil. Metallurgy is useful. Astronomical knowledge is accurate. Pharmacological knowledge has genuine applications. The problem is not the knowledge itself. The problem is the context of its transmission. Beings from a higher ontological order passing operative knowledge to beings in a lower one, without the corresponding transmission of the cosmological framework that would allow that knowledge to be used rightly. The knowledge arrives stripped of its context. It is power without orientation. The second book of Enoch, sometimes called Slavonic Enoch, makes this explicit in a way First Enoch only implies. In its description of the fallen watchers, it notes that they revealed eternal secrets, of secrets that were meant to be held at the higher order of being, not distributed into the material realm. The secrets are not wrong in themselves. They are wrong in their location. They belong above. They were brought down. And in the bringing down, they were separated from the conditions under which they were meaningful. This is a concept the Gnostic tradition will develop into one of its central frameworks, the problem of knowledge without anamnesis. Anamnesis, the unforgetting, the recovery of what you are at the level of origin, is the only context within which operative power of any kind can be used without producing harm. The Watchers had power. They had knowledge. What they transmitted to humanity was the power and the knowledge without the anamnesis, without the unforgetting of origin that would orient its use. Humanity received the tools. Humanity lost the map. And the world that resulted from that gift is, according to the texts, exactly the world you are living in right now. There is one human figure in this entire account who moves in the opposite direction. While the Watchers descend, while the Nephilim consume, while the transmitted knowledge reshapes the structure of human civilization in ways that progressively distance it from its origin, one man goes up. Enoch, seventh from Adam, in the genealogical line of Genesis 5, a figure who receives exactly one verse in the canonical text before disappearing into the most enigmatic 3 words in the Hebrew Bible. And he was not, for God took him. That is all Genesis gives you. He lived 365 years, he walked with God, and then he was not. First Enoch turns those 3 words into a complete cosmological treatise. Enoch, in the tradition preserved in First Enoch and elaborated in the subsequent Enochic literature, is the figure to whom the Watchers themselves appeal when they realize the gravity of what they have done. This is one of the most striking structural reversals in the entire text. The beings who have descended from a higher realm, who have broken the primary boundary, who have produced the Nephilim and transmitted forbidden knowledge, these beings are afraid. They know judgment is coming, and they ask a human being to intercede for them. Think about what that means cosmologically. The Watchers, beings of a higher order than humanity in the hierarchy of the material cosmos, are petitioning a human to speak on their behalf before the highest tribunal. The act of descent has not merely broken a rule, it has inverted the ontological order, by choosing to operate below their proper level, by choosing the material over the immaterial, by binding themselves to the lower realm through oath and act. The Watchers have forfeited the standing that would have allowed them to address the higher order directly. They need a mediator, and the only mediator available is the one human being who has maintained the orientation toward origin, who has, in the language of the Gnostic tradition, preserved something of his anamnesis. Enoch goes up to deliver their petition, and what he encounters in the ascent is described in First Enoch's Book of the Watchers with a density of cosmological detail that reads like a guided tour of the layers of reality above the material world. He passes through chambers of fire and ice. He sees the prison where fallen angels are held in darkness. He sees the throne, described in imagery that directly parallels the Merkabah mysticism of later Jewish tradition, the throne chariot, the wheels of fire, the living creatures, the voice like many waters, and he returns with a verdict. The petition of the Watchers is denied. There is no intercession possible, because the nature of the transgression is not the kind that intercession can address. The text has the divine response say this explicitly, and this is a paraphrase of the Charles translation of 1 Enoch 15. You are holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, but you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and you have begotten children with the blood of flesh, and, as the sons of men, you have lusted after flesh and blood, as those who die and are mortal do. The crime is ontological category violation, not moral failing in the conventional sense. Category violation. The Watchers were eternal, and they chose the mortal. They were immaterial, and they chose the material. They were oriented toward origin, and they chose the derivative. And having made that choice, having bound themselves to the lower order, they cannot be retrieved by intercession. The choice itself was the consequence. Enoch's role in the Gnostic interpretive tradition goes beyond this single episode of mediation. He becomes the archetypal pneumatic, the human being who has not fully surrendered to the sleep of material existence, who retains enough orientation toward origin to move vertically through the layers of reality rather than being confined to horizontal movement within the material plane. The fact that he walks with God in Genesis 5 is read not as religious piety in the conventional sense, but as a description of maintained cosmological orientation. He faces up. In a world that is increasingly structured to face down, he faces up. The Sethian Gnostic texts, particularly the texts discovered at Nag Hammadi, are deeply interested in the figure of Enoch as a prototype. The pneumatic human, the one who carries the spark of pleroma consciousness, who senses that this world is wrong, who feels the alienation that the Gnostic tradition treats not as pathology but as navigation, that figure has Enoch as its earliest textual ancestor. The Watchers went down, Enoch went up. The contrast is not incidental. It is the structural spine of everything the Enochic tradition is trying to tell you. The direction you face is the direction you move, and the direction you move determines what you become. The flood is traditionally told as a resolution. God saw the corruption, God acted. The flood came. The world was cleansed. 8 human beings and their cargo survived, and from that remnant humanity rebuilt. The canonical reading treats the flood as a successful correction, a reset, a new beginning, a divine intervention that addressed the problem of the Watchers and the Nephilim by removing the contaminated world and beginning again from a preserved line. The Enochic tradition does not support this reading, and neither does the trajectory of history, if you are willing to look at it clearly. First, Enoch treats the flood as a partial response to a structural problem. The physical bodies of the Nephilim were destroyed. The immediate violence, the consumption, the warfare that Azazel's knowledge had enabled, all of that was interrupted. The Watchers who had descended were bound, imprisoned in a place beneath the earth, held until the final judgment. These are real cosmic responses. They are not nothing, but they address the surface layer of the problem, not the structural layer. The spirits of the Nephilim, those disembodied entities that first Enoch describes, persisting after the physical deaths of the giant bodies, were not destroyed by the flood. Water addresses the material. It does not address the immaterial. The spirits remained. And according to first Enoch, they were granted a specific dispensation. A portion of them would be permitted to operate in the material world until the final age. This is the text. This is what it actually says. The correction was deliberate and deliberately incomplete. The Gnostic tradition reads the incompleteness of the flood correction as significant in a way the mainstream tradition has never adequately processed. If the problem introduced by the Watchers was ontological, if the boundary violation permanently altered the structure of the material realm in ways that made the archontic layer possible, then a physical correction cannot resolve it. You cannot drown a structural problem. You cannot wash away an ontological category error with water. The flood removes the most visible symptoms. It leaves the underlying architecture intact. There is a second reason the problem survived the flood that the texts point to, though with varying degrees of explicitness. The knowledge the Watchers transmitted did not die with the Nephilim. Human beings had already received it. Metallurgy, astrology, pharmacological knowledge, the arts of war and manipulation, all of that was in human hands before the waters rose. Noah's family, the 8 survivors, carried that knowledge through the flood with them, not as deliberate preservation of forbidden transmission, but simply because knowledge, once transmitted, cannot be untransmitted. You cannot make a human being forget how to forge metal by flooding the world. The capabilities survived because the human carriers survived. The Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century BCE text that retells Genesis and Exodus with additional detail, drawing from the same tradition as 1st Enoch, addresses this directly. In Jubilees, after the flood, Noah's son Ham and his descendants become the conduit through which the Watcher transmitted knowledge re-enters and re-spreads through the post-flood world. The knowledge is not new. It is the same pre-flood transmission, moving through a new generation of human hosts. The flood did not eliminate the vector, it only paused the spread. From the Gnostic standpoint, this is precisely what you would expect if the demiurge is the architect of the correction. The demiurge, the being whom the Sethian texts describe as the blind craftsman, the being who constructed the material world in ignorance of the pleroma above him, is not oriented toward genuine liberation. His corrections do not eliminate the prison, they rebuild it. They reform the walls without removing them. The flood is the first major instance of demiurgic correction, real in its immediate effects, structurally conservative in its ultimate result. The world after the flood is different in detail. It is identical in architecture. This is why the Gnostic tradition insists that salvation cannot come from within the system, not from obedience to the demiurge, not from the operation of material law, not from the repetitive cycles of catastrophe and reconstruction that the material world runs on. All of those are internal corrections to a system that is itself the problem. The flood is the clearest ancient illustration of this principle, the largest correction in recorded prehistory, and the structural problem survived it entirely. The Watchers introduced a contamination that water could not reach. The Nephilim left behind spirits that water could not drown. The knowledge they transmitted lives on in every civilization that has weaponized cosmological understanding for the purposes of control. The flood cleaned the surface. The deep structure remained. And into that deep structure, into a world that looked new, but was architecturally continuous with what came before the next layer of the problem would begin to emerge. Here is what the texts say happened after the flood receded and the waters pulled back from the drowned world. The bodies of the Nephilim were gone. The physical giants, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers and human women, the ones whose violence and appetites had accelerated the crisis to the point where a global reset became the operating solution, their bodies dissolved into the mud and silt of a remade Earth. You could walk the post-diluvian landscape and find no skeleton, no monument, no physical remainder. By every material measurement, they were finished. But the texts are very specific about what happened next. And this is where the story stops being about ancient history and starts being about the architecture of the world you are living in right now. The Book of Enoch, in the sections scholars date to roughly the 3rd century BCE, states it with a directness that the later canonical tradition could not bring itself to include. The spirits of the Nephilim, not their bodies, their spirits did not die with them. They were not absorbed back into the divine order. They were not neutralized by the water. They were, in the language of the text itself, released into the world as disembodied entities, and their mandate was to afflict, to lead astray, to attack, to do violence, and to cause destruction upon the earth. This is not metaphor. This is not spiritual poetry dressed up as history. The tradition treating these entities as literal post-mortem presences, rather than allegorical constructs, is consistent across multiple textual lineages: Enochic literature, the Dead Sea Scrolls, material from Qumran, fragments recovered from the Cairo Geniza, and later Gnostic frameworks that will become central to everything that follows in this narrative. The question the texts are answering is this: if the Watchers were imprisoned in the earth and the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, why does the world still feel wrong? Why does the contamination persist? Why, in every civilization that rose after the waters receded, do you find the same patterns, the same hierarchies of power built on esoteric knowledge hoarded by a priestly class, the same ritual violence dressed in cosmological justification, the same systematic suppression of direct divine contact in favor of mediated access through approved institutional channels? The answer, the texts give, is that the problem was never primarily physical. The Watcher's transgression was ontological. It happened at the level of being, not at the level of matter. And what persisted after the flood was not material, it was structural and spiritual. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim became what later traditions would identify as demons, as harmful intermediary entities, as the contaminating presences that operate below the threshold of ordinary perception, but above the threshold of consequence. The Gnostic tradition, when it eventually absorbed and reframed this entire cosmological narrative, gave these entities a name you may already know: Archons. But here is what most treatments of Gnostic cosmology omit, because most treatments begin with the Gnostic texts and treat them as self-contained. The Archons did not appear from nowhere. They are not a Gnostic invention. They are the end point of a lineage that runs backward through the Nephilim spirits, through the Watchers themselves, through the original transgression of the divine boundary between the imperishable realm and the constructed material world. To understand the Archons, what they are, how they operate, why they were described the way they were, in texts like the Apocryphon of John and the hypostasis of the Archons, you have to understand where they came from. And where they came from is here, this moment. The aftermath of the flood, when the earth looked clean and the deep structural wound was still wide open. The disembodied Nephilim spirits needed hosts. They needed points of contact with the physical world because their own physical existence had been severed. The Book of Enoch is explicit on this. They afflict human beings. They enter into human experience. They generate a kind of spiritual static that makes it harder for the pneumatic spark, the fragment of genuine divine awareness that certain human beings carry to function clearly, to remember what it is, to orient toward its actual source, rather than toward the constructed systems of the material world. This is the mechanism. This is the operating principle behind the contamination that the flood could not solve. Not a physical residue, but a spiritual population of entities whose entire existence is defined by displacement, cut off from the divine, cut off from physical embodiment, persistent in a world that was supposed to have been cleansed of them. And they did not stay disorganized. That is the part that matters most. Disorganized malevolence is dangerous. Organized malevolence is a system. And what the textual tradition describes across multiple independent sources is that the Nephilim spirits, the disembodied entities released into the post-Diluvian world, did not remain as a scattered, chaotic population of afflicting presences. They organized. This is the turn in the narrative that most popular treatments of this material miss entirely, and it is the turn that explains nearly everything about the relationship between the Watcher tradition and the fully developed Gnostic cosmology that emerged centuries later. The structure that the Enochic tradition describes is a hierarchy, not flat, not random, but ranked a system of authority and delegation that mirrors, deliberately and grotesquely, the hierarchical structure of the divine order it had been cut off from. The Watchers, the original divine beings who crossed the boundary, were themselves ranked. Shemiaza led them. Under him were named lieutenants, Azazel, whose specific transgression of transmitting the technology of war and the vanity of cosmetics and ornamentation gets its own dedicated section in the text because the tradition considered it especially significant. Amaros, credited with teaching the releasing of enchantments. Barakel, associated with astrology. Kokabel, associated with the science of constellations. These were not random figures. They were beings with specific domains, specific areas of transmitted knowledge, specific categories of human experience they had colonized. And when the flood removed their physical hybrid offspring, the organizational structure did not collapse. It transferred. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, operating now without physical form, retained the hierarchical logic they had been born into. The Gnostic texts, particularly the material from Nag Hammadi, describe the Archons in exactly these terms, not as a mob of random hostile entities, but as a ranked system, a bureaucracy of powers operating below the threshold of ordinary perception, each with a domain, each with a function within the larger apparatus of keeping the material world running as a system of containment. The hypostasis of the Archons, a text recovered at Nag Hammadi that scholars date to roughly the 3rd or 4th century CE, describes the Archons as organized under a chief ruler identified in that text as Samael, the blind god, who does not know that he himself is operating within a larger structure he cannot perceive. This is theologically precise in a way that casual reading often misses. The chief Archon is not all-knowing. He believes himself to be the highest power. His blindness is his defining characteristic. And the ranks beneath him operate within that same structural blindness, executing functions they mistake for ultimate purpose, maintaining a world they mistake for reality. Now, pull back and look at the lineage. The Watchers were divine beings who believed they could cross a boundary that was not theirs to cross, who believed their desire and their power gave them the right to reshape the terms of existence below them. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were beings of immense power who operated with the assumption that their strength entitled them to consume and dominate without limit. The disembodied spirits of the Nephilim organized into a hierarchical system that believed itself to be the governing structure of reality. Each generation of this lineage is characterized by the same core error, mistaking a partial position for a total one, mistaking a fragment of power for sovereignty, mistaking the ability to operate within a realm for the authority to define it. This is the genealogy of the Archons. Not as a separate Gnostic innovation, but as the accumulated consequence of a transgression that began at the boundary between the imperishable realm and the constructed world of matter. The Gnostic tradition, when it received this material and integrated it into its own cosmological framework, was not inventing a new mythology. It was providing the most systematic and philosophically precise account of a process that the Enochic tradition had described in narrative form centuries earlier. The Archons are the organizational endpoint of a corruption that began with the Watchers. The blind chief ruler is the institutional expression of the same foundational error that Shemyaza made when he led 200 divine beings across a threshold they were never meant to cross. The Book of Jubilees, which scholars date to roughly the 2nd century BCE and which represents a different strand of the same broader tradition, adds a detail that is easy to overlook but structurally critical. When the post-flood negotiations occurred, when Noah interceded on behalf of humanity, a tenth of the Nephilim spirits were left free, not imprisoned, not destroyed, left free, by agreement, under the authority of Mastema, a figure whose name translates to hostility or enmity. This is not a casual narrative detail. This is the tradition's way of saying that the organizational structure of the disembodied hierarchy was formally recognized, even accommodated within the post-flood cosmic settlement. The Archons were not an accident. They were a residue that became a structure. And that structure had a long reach. Of all the Watchers named in the tradition, Azazel receives the most specific and sustained indictment, and the reason is not that his transgression was the most dramatic in narrative terms. It is that his transgression was the most consequential in civilizational terms. The first book of Enoch assigns to Azazel a very specific list. He taught men the making of swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He showed them metals of the earth and how to work them. He taught women the making of bracelets and ornaments, the use of cosmetics, the enhancement of the exterior self as a technology of attraction and status. And then the text delivers its verdict. All the sin in the world is attributed to Azazel. That is a remarkable statement. The tradition is not saying Azazel was the worst watcher in terms of raw destructive power. It is saying that what he transmitted created a self-sustaining system of sin, a set of technologies and practices that, once introduced, reproduced themselves through human culture without requiring ongoing divine transgression to maintain. The Watchers could be imprisoned in the valleys of the earth, and Azazel's transmission would keep operating through the societies it had already structured. Let that settle for a moment. The most catastrophic legacy of the Watchers was not supernatural violence, it was culture. It was the specific shape of what human civilization became once it absorbed these transmissions. The metallurgical knowledge, the capacity to work iron and bronze into weapons with precision and intentionality, did not just give humans better tools for killing. It gave them the foundational infrastructure for organized warfare, for the kind of sustained military violence that enabled the construction of empires. Every empire in human history, from the earliest Mesopotamian city-states through to the late antique world that would eventually attempt to suppress the very texts we are discussing, runs on the back of metallurgical knowledge, the capacity to produce weapons at scale, to arm standing armies, to engineer siege machines and fortifications. This is the Azazelian inheritance operating across millennia. The second transmission, the knowledge of ornamentation, cosmetics, the technologies of appearance, is easier to dismiss as trivial until you think carefully about what it actually introduced. Before this transmission, according to the tradition, human self-presentation was natural, unmediated, unmanipulated. After it, the exterior self became a technology, something that could be shaped, augmented, weaponized for social advantage. This is the foundation of every system of status display that has structured human social hierarchy since. The clothing that signals rank, the ornamentation that communicates wealth, the cosmetic modification that signals reproductive fitness or social desirability, the entire apparatus of appearance as social currency. The Gnostic tradition would later articulate this in different but structurally identical terms. The Archons do not only operate through direct spiritual affliction, they operate through systems, through the structures of social life that orient human attention outward and downward, toward the material world and its metrics of value, and away from the interior recognition that is the only path to genuine understanding of what a human being actually is. Azazel's transmissions accomplished exactly this. They gave humanity the tools to build a civilization so structurally absorbing, so demanding of attention and participation and investment, that the interior orientation, the remembering of the pneumatic spark, the anamnesis becomes perpetually deferred. There is always a war to fight. There is always a hierarchy to navigate. There is always a competition for status and resources and the approval of the social order. Every one of these is a consequence of the transmissions that Azazel introduced. The scapegoat ritual in Leviticus, the practice on Yom Kippur of sending a goat into the wilderness bearing the sins of the community, sent specifically to Azazel, is the tradition's own acknowledgement of this. The rabbinical tradition debated vigorously what this ritual meant, because sending a sacrifice to a fallen being is theologically uncomfortable within a strict monotheistic framework. But the ritual is there. It predates the theological discomfort, and it reflects a very old memory, that Azazel was understood to be the recipient of something, a transference of the contamination he had introduced, because the tradition recognized him as the source of that contamination. Now, consider the trajectory. Azazel's transmissions enter human culture before the flood. The flood does not erase them because they are encoded in human knowledge, in human social practice, in the structural logic of how human communities organize themselves. The post-flood world rebuilds using the same foundational templates: metallurgical hierarchy, warfare as the ultimate arbiter of territorial and political disputes, status competition organized around appearance and display. The civilizations that rise in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in the Yellow River Basin, all of them, without exception, reproduce these patterns. This is not coincidence. This is transmission. This is the Azazelian inheritance operating exactly as the tradition said it would, without requiring ongoing supernatural intervention, sustaining itself through the cultural logic it had embedded in the human social world. And it did not operate alone. Azazel's domain was one strand. The others were being woven simultaneously. Parallel to Azazel's metallurgical and cosmetic transmissions, other watchers were delivering a different category of knowledge, one whose consequences were equally far-reaching, but whose mechanism of containment was more subtle, more elegant, and in some ways more total. Barakel, Kokabel, and several others in the Enochic enumeration are credited with transmitting astronomical and astrological knowledge, the reading of celestial signs, the interpretation of stellar positions as determinants of earthly fate, the mapping of a correspondence between the movements of bodies in the heavens and the unfolding of events in the lives of human beings below. On its surface, this sounds like science, and a version of it is the observation of celestial cycles, the tracking of planetary movements, the development of calendrical systems based on astronomical regularity. These are genuine cognitive achievements, and every advanced civilization in human history developed some version of them. The question the Enochic tradition is asking is not whether the knowledge itself is accurate. It is asking what that knowledge does to the human beings who receive it, in the form the Watchers transmitted it. Here is the distinction the tradition is drawing. There is a difference between understanding that the celestial order reflects the structure of divine reality, which is a Platonic and Gnostic insight, and a legitimate one, and understanding that the celestial order determines your fate in such a way that you are bound to it, governed by it, unable to act outside the parameters it defines. The first insight is liberating. It reveals a coherence in the cosmos that points toward the divine order above. The second is imprisoning. It places the human being under the authority of the planetary and stellar rulers in a way that forecloses any genuine transcendence. The Watcher transmission of astrological knowledge, in the Enochic framing, was the second kind. It was not knowledge that pointed upward through the celestial structure to what lies beyond it. It was knowledge that anchored human consciousness to the celestial structure as the final authority that made the stars and planets the ceiling of meaningful reality, rather than a visible layer of a much larger architecture. The Gnostic cosmological systems, particularly the Valentinian and Sethian frameworks, developed this insight into one of their most powerful and technically precise arguments. The 7 planetary Archons, the rulers of what they called the Hebdomad, the sevenfold structure of the lower heavens, are precisely the entities that the astrological transmission installed as the governing powers of material existence. Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon. In the Gnostic mapping, each of these celestial bodies corresponds to an archontic ruler, a power that governs a specific domain of material experience and extracts a specific kind of psychic toll from the souls that pass through its sphere. The soul descending into material incarnation, in this framework, passes through each planetary sphere in sequence. At each level it acquires a new layer of limitation, a new governing passion, a new structural constraint on its awareness and freedom. By the time it reaches the material world, it has been so thoroughly clothed in archontic layers that the pneumatic spark within it, the fragment of genuine divine awareness, is almost completely insulated from its own nature. This is the astrological transmission as the Gnostic tradition received and reframed it. Not simply a body of astronomical knowledge, but the installation of a cosmological framework that makes the archontic hierarchy feel like the natural order of things. When you believe the stars determine your character, your fate, your relational patterns, your vulnerabilities, when you believe the planetary rulers are the ultimate authorities governing your existence. You have accepted the archontic claim to sovereignty at the deepest level of your self-understanding. The genius of this transmission is that it does not require coercion. It is freely adopted because it offers genuine predictive power and genuine explanatory utility. The stars do move in predictable cycles. Certain planetary positions do correlate with identifiable patterns in human experience, not because the stars are the source of those patterns, but because the celestial order and human experience are both reflections of a deeper structural reality. The astrological transmission hijacks this genuine correspondence and reframes it as determinism. The stars don't reflect what you are, they control what you will be. Every culture that absorbed this transmission built institutions around it. Temple complexes oriented to stellar alignments. Priestly classes whose authority derived from their ability to read the celestial signs and translate them for a population that depended on that mediation. Royal legitimacy established through astrological calculation, the idea that certain individuals were born under configurations that entitled them to rule. The cosmological architecture of the Watcher transmission becoming the political architecture of every subsequent civilization. This is Kokobel's legacy operating across 4,000 years of human institutional history, not as a continuous supernatural intervention, as a transmitted framework that structured human self-understanding in such a way that the archontic hierarchy feels not like an imposition, but like the natural shape of reality. When the Gnostic tradition names the planetary rulers as Archons and describes their function as the management and containment of human awareness, it is not inventing a theological abstraction. It is describing the endpoint of a transmission that the Enochic tradition placed at the very beginning of the contamination, in the moment when certain watchers looked at the human beings below them and decided to give them a map that showed the cage as the territory. Here is what makes this transmission so precise, so durable, so extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. It was not designed to convince, it was designed to replace. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. A system designed to convince operates on the surface of awareness. It presents arguments, it appeals to authority, it offers evidence. You can contest it, you can walk away from it. You retain the awareness that something is being offered to you, and that you have the option to refuse. A system designed to replace operates at a deeper level entirely. It does not offer you a new idea about the world. It installs a new structure for perceiving the world, and then it teaches you to call that structure reality. Once it is in place, you do not argue with it. You cannot argue with it. You cannot see it well enough to argue with it. It has become the water you swim in, the air you breathe, the shape of the questions you are allowed to ask. This is what the Watchers transmitted, not a false religion, a false ontology. The Book of Enoch is precise about the scope of what was given. Astronomy, the reading of celestial signs, the arts of enchantment and seduction, the knowledge of metals and of roots, and of the fabrication of weapons. Each of these is a map. Each map encodes an assumption about what the world is and what your position in it amounts to. The celestial map tells you that the sky is a mechanism that determines your fate. The metallurgical map tells you that power comes from the capacity to extract, to smelt, to forge, that the earth is a resource, and the human who controls its transformation controls everything. The map of roots and signs tells you that hidden forces are real, and that the only way to navigate them is through specialized knowledge held by specialists. Notice what none of these maps includes. None of them point inward. None of them suggest that the deepest layer of what you are is something prior to all of this, something that the celestial mechanism cannot touch, something that no weapon can reach, something that requires no specialist and no transmission because it is already and always fully itself. The Gnostic texts call that deepest layer the pneuma, the divine spark, the fragment of the pleroma consciousness that exists inside the material frame, the way light exists inside a lamp, using the lamp, but not reducible to it, not trapped by it, properly understood, confused about it, yes, habituated to treating the lamp as if it were the light, but not actually imprisoned. The imprisonment is an epistemic condition, a condition of what you know and how you know it, and what categories you are using to understand yourself. And this is precisely what the Watcher transmission was designed to foreclose. Not to prevent the pneuma from existing, it cannot do that, but to ensure that the categories available for self-understanding never pointed toward it, to ensure that every available map showed you something else, your fate in the stars, your power through your weapons, your significance through your lineage, your access to the hidden through priests who controlled it. Every map, pointing away from the one thing the transmission needed you to not find. The Book of Jubilees, written somewhere in the 2nd century before the Common Era and preserved in full only in the Ethiopic tradition, adds a dimension to this that the Book of Enoch does not foreground. Jubilees is concerned with the demonic legacy of the Watchers, the spirits of the Nephilim who survived the flood not as physical bodies but as disembodied influences, malicious spirits. And Jubilees says something remarkable about them, that they were given permission. Not unlimited permission, bounded permission. The text describes a negotiation between their leader, Mastema, and the divine, in which Mastema argues that if all the spirits are bound, he will have no capacity to execute his function. And his function, in Jubilees, is the testing and the leading astray of humanity. What Jubilees is encoding in that negotiation is a cosmological claim about the architecture of this world. The distorting forces are not accidents. They are not external invasions that the divine failed to prevent. They are structural features of a world that was set up with their presence built in. The confusion is not a bug. It is, in the most disturbing possible reading of the text, a design specification. This is where the Gnostic framework takes the Enochic material and pushes it to its logical conclusion. If the distorting forces are structural, if they are built into the architecture, then the world itself was built by something that wanted the distortion, the demiurge, the false god. The blind one who believed himself to be God because he could not see what was above him. The Watchers are not the origin of the problem. They are an early expression of a structural principle that runs through the entire constructed world. And the transmission they delivered was not a deviation from that world's logic. It was a perfect embodiment of it. There is a figure standing at the center of all of this, who almost no one in mainstream religious culture has properly reckoned with. Not because he is obscure, his name appears in Genesis, in the New Testament, in the Islamic tradition, in the Talmud, but because the version of him that has been handed down through institutional religion is a shadow of what the original texts describe. A footnote, a curiosity, a man who walked with God and was not, for God took him. 7 words in the canonical Hebrew text, 7 words for one of the most explosive figures in the entire ancient religious imagination. His name is Enoch, and what the texts that bear his name actually describe is not a pious man who pleased God and was rewarded with a convenient disappearance. What they describe is a human being who was taken through the architecture of the cosmos and shown how it actually works, who was brought before the divine throne and given a commission, who returned in some versions of the tradition to deliver a testimony that the Watchers themselves had pleaded with him to carry because they were too afraid to bring it themselves. That detail alone deserves to be held for a moment. The Watchers, the beings who descended from the heavenly realm, who possessed knowledge and power that made them categorically different from any human, who had already transgressed the boundary between their realm and this one, those beings could not approach the divine presence to plead their own case. They needed a human intermediary. They needed Enoch. The first book of Enoch describes this explicitly. The Watchers approach Enoch and ask him to write out their petition and to carry it before the divine throne on their behalf. They dictate to him. He transcribes. He enters a visionary state, a dream, the text says, though what it describes is not a dream in any ordinary sense, and in that state he is conveyed through layers of heaven that the text describes with architectural precision, fire, and crystal walls, a house built of tongues of fire and ice, a second house, greater than the first, burning with such intensity that Enoch falls on his face because he cannot bear to look at it, and in that innermost chamber he receives the answer. The petition of the Watchers is denied. They will not return to their original station. Their children, the giants, will not be saved. And the spirits of the Nephilim, the beings who emerge from the giants after the flood, will be loosed on the earth until the final age. But something else happens in that visionary journey, something the texts are more careful about encoding, that requires the reader to track the implications rather than follow a direct statement. Enoch, in being taken through the heavens, is shown the structural hierarchy of the cosmos. He sees the stars in their chambers. He sees the winds and the storehouses of frost. He sees the places where the souls of the dead wait. He sees the places where the angels who did not fall maintain their stations. He sees, in other words, the machinery. And this matters enormously for what we are tracing across this entire narrative, because Enoch is not shown the machinery so that he can be impressed by it. He is shown it so that he can understand what has been done and what has been broken. The Watcher transgression is not an isolated incident in the text. It is a violation of an order that Enoch is being allowed to perceive from the inside. He is being given the blueprint of what was built, so that the fact of its corruption becomes comprehensible. The later Enochic literature, particularly the material that scholars group under the heading of the Second Book of Enoch, a Slavonic text whose precise origins are disputed, but which preserves traditions that appear to be genuinely ancient, expands this visionary journey into something that reads less like an apocalyptic revelation and more like an initiatory curriculum. In that text, Enoch moves through 10 heavens. Each heaven is a layer of the cosmological architecture. Each layer has its inhabitants, its functions, its qualities. And Enoch, moving through them, is being educated, not entertained, not simply shown. He is being transformed by the seeing of it. By the 10th heaven, the text says, he is transformed entirely. He is taken out of his human form and given a garment of glory and a new name, and he becomes one of the standing ones, one of the angelic beings whose function is to stand before the divine presence and maintain the song of continuous praise. This is the Enoch that institutional religion did not transmit. The mystic, the initiate, the human being who walked through the full architecture of the cosmos and came back changed by the knowledge of what he had seen. The 7 words in Genesis are not a reward for piety. They are a marker pointing toward a vast tradition that the compilers of the canonical text chose not to include. And what that tradition contains is a cosmological education far more complete, far more structurally detailed, and far more threatening to institutional religious authority than anything the 7 words suggest. Let's be precise about what the Nephilim actually are in the framework we have been building, because the popular imagination has turned them into giants, enormous physical beings who walked the earth before the flood and were destroyed by it. And while that element is present in the texts, it is the least interesting thing about them. The most interesting thing about them is what they represent structurally, what they are as a category of being, what problem they introduce into the cosmological architecture that neither the divine realm nor the material realm had faced before. Start with the Watchers themselves. They are beings whose existence is entirely coherent within their proper domain. In the heavenly realm, they are what they are supposed to be: conscious, powerful, capable of perception that operates on a register unavailable to embodied beings. They belong there. Their nature is calibrated for that environment. Then they cross the boundary. They take physical form, or interact with physical form deeply enough that the interaction produces offspring, and those offspring, the Nephilim, are beings who do not belong to either realm. This is the structural problem, not moral, not legal, in any ordinary sense, structural. The Nephilim are hybrid consciousness, carrying within them a quality of awareness that is inappropriate for a fully material existence. Embedded in bodies that are fully material, they cannot go back to where their fathers came from. They cannot be simply human, because they are not simply human. They are a category error given flesh, a conscious contradiction, walking around in the world. The Book of Enoch is explicit about what happens to them when they die. Their bodies return to the earth, but their spirits, the dimension of their being that carried the Watcher heritage, have nowhere to go. They cannot return to the heavenly realm. That path is closed to them. They cannot proceed through the normal process of whatever awaits the souls of ordinary human dead. They are, in a very specific sense, displaced, cosmologically homeless. And the text says that in that state of displacement, they become what it calls evil spirits, and they afflict and oppress and lead astray the children of men, and they do so until the day of the great consummation. Now hold that image, and look at what the Gnostic tradition does with the concept of consciousness that does not belong to the material realm, but finds itself embedded in it anyway. The pneumatic human, the person who carries the divine spark, is, in the Gnostic framework, precisely a being whose deepest nature is incommensurate with the material world it finds itself in. Not because of a transgression, not because of a fall in the sense of a moral failure, but because the material world was constructed in such a way that consciousness of divine origin, consciousness that belongs to the pleroma, ends up inside bodies in a world that was not built to support it, or recognize it, or allow it to remember what it is. The Gnostic tradition and the Enochic tradition are describing the same structural problem from 2 different angles. The Nephilim experience it from the outside. They are hybrid beings whose displacement is visible, whose violence and chaos is a symptom of what it costs a consciousness to be radically out of place. The pneumatic human experiences it from the inside, the sense of alienation, the persistent feeling that this world is not right, not home, not sufficient, that something has been lost or obscured that cannot quite be named. Both traditions agree on the source of the problem. Something came from above and intersected with the material level in a way that introduced a kind of consciousness into this realm that this realm was not built to contain. The Enochic texts call the agents of that intersection the Watchers. The Gnostic texts, at different moments and in different documents, distribute that function across the Sophia's fall. The Demiurge's ignorant construction, and the Archons who maintain the boundary conditions of the material prison. But what is crucial to see, and this is the connective tissue between these two vast traditions, is that in both cases, the problem is not evil in a simple moral sense. The problem is structural misalignment, consciousness operating in a register that the available architecture cannot accommodate. And the consequences of that misalignment, the violence, the confusion, the oppression, the spiritual affliction, are not punishments, they are symptoms. They are what happens when something is in the wrong place and does not know how to get back. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which represent a community that was deeply invested in the Enochic tradition, add a dimension to this that has only become fully visible with the scholarly work of the last several decades. The sectarian documents from Qumran, the community rule, the War Scroll, the Damascus document describe a world structured by a cosmic dualism. Two spirits, the spirit of truth and the spirit of deceit. Every human being is a mixture of both, in proportions that determine their spiritual situation. And behind that dualism stands a cosmological hierarchy that looks, when you look at it carefully, remarkably like the Archontic hierarchy that the Gnostic texts describe. The Prince of Light and the Angel of Darkness, the lot of God and the lot of Belial, and a world in which both operate, structurally, by design, a design that the community at Qumran believed was approaching its final resolution. The contamination introduced by the Watcher transgression was, for them, not a permanent condition. It was a condition with a term, a design period of confusion and oppression that would end at a moment they called the Visitation, when the final battle would be fought and the structure of displacement would be dissolved. This is a tradition that knows exactly what has been contaminated, knows what contaminated it, and is waiting with a precision that suggests they understood the mechanism better than we have been taught to assume for the contamination to be reversed. There is a mountain in the ancient Near East that appears in more documents bearing on this tradition than almost any other physical location. It sits at the intersection of what is now Lebanon, Syria, and the territory that was once northern Israel. Its highest peak rises more than 9,000 feet above sea level. In ancient times, it was considered a boundary, a place where the divine realm and the human realm were closer to each other than anywhere else on the Earth's surface, Mount Hermon. And according to the first book of Enoch, it is the precise location where the Watchers descended. The text is not vague about this. It says that 200 of them came down on the summit of Hermon, and that they swore an oath to one another, a mutual oath, binding them all equally to what they were about to do, so that none could later claim he was merely following, and that from that moment the transmission began. The choice of location is not incidental. Ancient Near Eastern cosmology consistently treated high places as points of contact between the heavenly realm and the earthly one. The gods were understood to reside on mountains, or to descend to mountains when they intersected with the human world. The Canaanite texts from Ugarit, which are contemporaneous with significant portions of the Hebrew scriptural tradition, describe the divine assembly gathering on a sacred mountain, the mountain of El, the father of the gods, and conducting the cosmic governance of the world from that peak. When the Enochic texts place the Watcher descent on Mount Hermon, they are encoding a specific claim within the cosmological grammar of their culture. This is not a descent from outside the known world. This is a descent through the precise point where the layers of cosmic hierarchy touch each other. The Watchers did not bypass the structure. They descended through it. And what they brought with them, the transmission of arts and knowledge, and the seed that would produce the Nephilim, came down through that same point of contact. Now trace what happens to that transmission across the history that follows. The flood, in the Enochic framework, is not simply a punishment for human wickedness. It is a structural reset, an attempt to clear the contamination introduced by the Watcher descent. The giants are destroyed, the Watchers are bound. The world is returned to something closer to its original condition. But, and this is the critical but, not completely. The Book of Jubilees is clear that the spirits of the Nephilim survive. They persist, and they are granted, in that negotiation between Mastema and the divine, a continuing function in the world that follows the flood. So, the reset is partial. The transmission continues, not through the bodies of the Watchers, who are bound, not through the bodies of the Nephilim, who are dead, but through the disembodied spirits, the persistent remainder of a hybrid consciousness, and through the cultural and intellectual legacy of what the Watchers taught. The knowledge of celestial patterns, the arts of metallurgy and agriculture and warfare, the systems of divination and enchantment, these do not disappear with the flood. They reappear, reformulated, reconstituted, in the civilizations that emerge on the other side. This is not a claim about historical continuity in a simple sense. It is a claim about the persistence of a structure. The Gnostic tradition, when it describes the Archons as planetary rulers, assigning each planet a ruler, giving each ruler a specific function in the management and containment of human awareness, is working with a framework that traces precisely back through this chain. The planets as sources of fatalistic determination, the celestial realm as a mechanism of control rather than a domain of freedom, the correspondence between the outer hierarchy and the inner condition of the soul. These are all features of the astral mythology that the Enochic texts identify as part of the Watcher transmission. Azazel taught the reading of signs. Shemihaza taught the enchantments. The combined transmission produced a world in which the celestial machinery was understood as determinative, where your fate was written in the stars, and the specialists who could read the stars held the keys to your future. That is an archontic cosmology, not metaphorically. Structurally, it positions consciousness as subject to external hierarchical forces, teaches that those forces are both real and unavoidable, and routes access to any negotiation with them through a specialized class of intermediaries. The Valentinian Gnostic texts of the 2nd century of the Common Era. Valentinus himself was teaching in Rome around 140 CE, and his school produced some of the most sophisticated theological documents in the entire Gnostic tradition, described the planetary archons in precisely those terms. Each archon governs a sphere. Each sphere functions as a checkpoint. The soul ascending after death, attempting to return to the pleroma, must pass through each checkpoint in turn. And at each checkpoint, the archon demands something, a password, a gesture, a recognition that the uninitiated soul cannot provide. This is the Watcher transmission at its terminal expression. The knowledge that was brought down through the point where heaven and earth touch each other, transmitted through the Nephilim and their legacy, reconstituted through the post-flood civilizations, crystallized into the astrological and hierarchical frameworks of the ancient world, and finally encoded by the Gnostic tradition in the image of planetary archons as gatekeepers who stand between the imprisoned soul and the freedom it has forgotten it ever had. Mount Hermon to the planetary spheres, the oath of the Watchers to the checkpoints of the Archons. The same transmission, the same structure, the same function, the management of consciousness through hierarchically organized knowledge systems that point the attention outward and upward into the machinery, and never, not once, inward toward the thing that needs no gate, no password, and no specialist to access it. So, let's be precise about what was actually being transmitted through the Nephilim lineage. Because the popular understanding stops at the physical giants, warriors, beings of supernatural power who walked the earth before the flood, that is the surface layer. That is the part the texts were allowed to keep. What runs underneath it is a structural claim about knowledge and control that is considerably more disturbing. The Watchers did not simply produce offspring. They produced a class of beings who were constitutionally positioned between two registers of reality, the divine and the terrestrial, the celestial and the material. The Nephilim were not merely large, they were hybrid administrators, half human in the sense that they were embedded in matter, subject to mortality, capable of suffering, half Watcher in the sense that they carried encoded access to the knowledge systems their fathers had brought down from the higher registers. This is why the Book of Enoch is so specific about what the Watchers taught and to whom they taught it. It is not a random catalogue of forbidden arts. It is a curriculum. Azazel teaches metallurgy and weaponry, the capacity to shape matter, to harden it, to make it lethal. Semyaza and his companions teach enchantments, root cutting, astrology. Others teach cosmetics, the art of ornamentation, the manipulation of perceived beauty. Others teach the reading of omens, the interpretation of natural signs, divination through thunder and lightning. Read that list carefully. What is it describing? It is describing the foundations of civilizational control infrastructure. Metallurgy means armies, means hierarchies of violence, means states. Astrology means the ability to read time, to predict, to claim that the movements of celestial bodies govern human fate, which is to say, The ability to locate authority, not in the person standing in front of you, but in an abstract cosmic machinery that only specialists can interpret. Divination means the institutionalization of uncertainty, the creation of a permanent class of interpreters who must be consulted before any significant decision can be made. This is not forbidden knowledge in the sense of secret wisdom that liberates. This is forbidden knowledge in the sense of classified infrastructure, the underlying code of the control system, made available to a hybrid class precisely so they could administer it on behalf of their fathers. The Nephilim were not victims of the Watcher's transgression. They were the first implementation of its design. And here is where the Gnostic tradition picks up the thread in a way that makes the cosmological architecture suddenly visible. Because the Gnostics were not reading the Watcher narrative as history in the conventional sense. They were reading it as an account of how the Archonic system embedded itself into human civilization. The Watchers, in this reading, are not merely rogue angels who succumbed to desire. They are the first terrestrial deployment of the same hierarchical, gatekeeping intelligence that the Archons represent at the cosmic level. The Archons control the planetary spheres. They manage what information passes between registers of reality. They ensure that the divine spark trapped in matter never receives the direct signal it would need to recognize itself. They accomplish this through the architecture of fate, the idea that the positions of planets at your birth have determined your character, your tendencies, your possibilities, your limitations. You were born under Saturn. You were born under Mars. Your soul passed through these gates on its way into embodiment, and each gate extracted something, modified something, imposed a layer of conditional identity over the thing that was actually there before any gate was ever constructed. The Watchers, arriving at Mount Hermon, performed an exactly parallel operation on the civilizational level. They introduced the interpretive frameworks, astrological, divinatory, metallurgical, cosmetic, that would ensure human attention remained oriented toward the external machinery, toward the signs in the sky, toward the strength of the weapon in the hand, toward the beauty of the body, the reading of omens, the management of fate through ritual and specialist knowledge, not toward the interior, not toward the pneuma, not toward the thing that was already present and already complete before any Watcher ever descended and any Archon ever positioned itself at any gate. This is the continuity the mainstream reading misses. It treats the Watcher narrative and the Gnostic Archon framework as separate mythological systems from different cultural contexts that happen to share some surface features. But the deeper you go into both traditions, the clearer the structural identity becomes. The Watchers did not precede the Archons in the sense of being a different phenomenon. They were the Archons, operating at the human civilizational level, before the Gnostic tradition had developed the precise cosmological vocabulary to name what they were. Now let's address the Flood. Because the conventional reading of the Flood narrative in the Book of Genesis, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Atrahasis text, across the ancient Near Eastern tradition, is that it was a punishment. God, or the gods, looked at what humanity had become and found it corrupt, and decided to destroy it and start again. Noah, or Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra, is the righteous survivor, the seed of a clean lineage, the reset point. That is the surface reading. And it is almost certainly not the operational logic of the Flood as the Enochic tradition understands it. The Book of Enoch is explicit on this point in a way that the canonical Genesis account carefully avoids. The Flood in the Enochic framework is not primarily a response to human wickedness. Human wickedness is a secondary effect. The primary cause is the Nephilim themselves, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers who are consuming the earth, depleting its resources, turning on human beings and devouring them, and generating a kind of ontological contamination that the higher registers of reality cannot tolerate. The archangels Michael, Sarachiel, Raphael, Gabriel bring the complaint before the throne, and the response is not the language of moral judgment, it is the language of containment. Bind Azazel, seal the Watchers in the valleys of the earth. Let the Nephilim destroy each other, then send the Flood to cleanse the surface. This is not punishment theology, this is emergency containment procedure. And the crucial detail, the one that changes everything about how you read the post-Flood world, is what survives. The Watchers are bound. Their bodies, their physical presence, is removed from the terrestrial plane, but the knowledge they transmitted is not bound. It cannot be bound, because it has already been encoded into the lineage of the Nephilim, into the cultural institutions those beings helped construct, into the interpretive frameworks that entire civilizations had already organized themselves around. The flood destroys the bodies. It does not destroy the transmission. This is the claim that the Enochic tradition makes in texts like the Book of Jubilees, where demons described explicitly as the spirits of the dead Nephilim, disembodied after the flood destroyed, their physical form are permitted to continue operating in the world at a reduced capacity. 1/10 of them, in the Jubilees account, are allowed to remain active. They cannot fully incarnate. They cannot rebuild what the Watchers built. But they can influence. They can transmit. They can continue to orient human attention toward the external machinery of fate and away from the interior source. The flood did not end the Watcher project. It changed its operating format. Now read this against the Gnostic account of how the Archons respond to humanity's divine potential. In the Apocryphon of John, the text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, dated by scholars to approximately the 2nd century CE, but drawing on traditions considerably older, the Archons respond to the recognition that humanity carries a divine spark by attempting multiple rounds of containment. First, they attempt to keep the human being entirely bound in matter. When that fails, and the pneumatic element begins to awaken, they construct additional mechanisms: fate, forgetfulness, the distortion of the divine image through the introduction of desire, fear, and mortality consciousness. The Apocryphon of John describes this as a flood of its own kind, not water, but forgetfulness. The Archons, recognizing that direct suppression has not worked, flood the human psyche with the waters of oblivion, with the experience of being embedded in a mortal body in a physical world where survival demands constant attention to external conditions. The flood of matter, the flood of sensation, the flood of the ordinary, which is itself a sophisticated mechanism for keeping the attention away from the pneuma. Place the two accounts side by side. The Enochic flood destroys the bodies of the Nephilim and leaves the disembodied spirits of their knowledge still operating in the world. The Gnostic flood of forgetfulness destroys the soul's access to its own origin and leaves the mechanisms of archonic management still operating in the psyche. Different scales, different registers, but structurally the same operation. Containment that doesn't fully contain. Erasure that doesn't fully erase. A reset that preserves the essential architecture of the problem in a new and harder to identify form. This is why the tradition that runs from Enoch through the Gnostic cosmologies is so insistent on the theme of remnant knowledge, on the idea that something survives every flood, every burning, every institutional suppression, not the bodies, not the original structures, but the transmission itself, which finds new vessels and new languages in every generation, because the thing it is describing has not changed, was not destroyed by any flood, and cannot be contained by any Archon regardless of how many gates it constructs. There is one figure in this entire tradition who occupies a position no one else occupies. Not an angel, not a watcher, not a Nephilim, not a flood survivor. A human being who was taken into the structure of the celestial machinery, walked through it, was shown everything, understood it completely, and then returned. Enoch. The canonical text of Genesis dispenses with him in 2 sentences. He lived 365 years, he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That is the entirety of the canonical treatment of a figure who, in the tradition that grew up around those 2 sentences, became one of the most significant transmitters of suppressed cosmological knowledge in the entire ancient world. The Book of Enoch, 1st Enoch, the Ethiopic version, preserved in its complete form only in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, is not a marginal text. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, meaning it was being read and studied by the community there in the centuries before and during the time of Jesus. Scholars date the earliest portions, the Book of the Watchers, to the 3rd century BCE, though the traditions it encodes are almost certainly older. It was cited as authoritative by the author of the New Testament letter of Jude, which means it was circulating in early Christian communities as a respected source. Then it disappeared, or more precisely, it was made to disappear. The church councils that fixed the biblical canon excluded it, not because it was unfamiliar, because it was too specific about things the institutional church could not afford to let its congregations read. What Enoch sees, in the visionary journeys that form the core of the text, is the full architecture of the celestial machinery. He is taken by angels, specifically by Uriel, whose name means light of God, which in this context carries considerable irony through the layers of the heavens. He sees the storehouses of weather, the chambers of the winds, the places where the souls of the dead wait for judgment. He sees the prison where the watchers are bound, in the valleys of the earth, in darkness, awaiting their final sentence. He sees Azazel, the one who taught the arts of metal and war, chained in the desert of Dudael under rocks and darkness until the day of judgment. He also sees the throne. He approaches what the text calls the great glory, the highest register of reality, and he is addressed directly. He is given the task of returning to the Watchers with the news that their petition for mercy has been denied. Their spirits will not be received. They will remain bound. Their children will watch each other die, and will themselves receive no peace. And then Enoch is brought back. He returns to the earth. He transmits what he saw. This is the structural move that the Enochic tradition is making, and it is a move with enormous implications for everything that comes after it. Enoch is not a god. He is not an angel. He is a human being who was given access to the complete architecture of the system, the celestial hierarchy, the positions of the Watchers, the nature of judgment, the structure of the cosmos from its innermost registers to its outermost, and who survived that access and brought the knowledge back. In the Gnostic tradition, this figure has a direct parallel. The Gnostic texts, and specifically the Hermetic texts that overlap with Gnostic cosmology, describe the figure of the divine Anthropos, the primordial human, who also descends through the planetary spheres, who also passes through every level of the Archonic hierarchy, and who also carries within themselves the divine light that the Archons cannot touch, even as they attempt to layer conditional identities over it. Enoch went up and came back. The divine Anthropos descended and is working its way back up. Different directions on the same axis, describing the same territory from opposite ends of the journey. What both figures bring back, what both figures essentially are, is the testimony that the machinery is not the final reality, that you can pass through every gate of the Archonic hierarchy, encounter every Watcher in its bound or active form, be shown the complete structure of the prison, and there is still something in you that the prison cannot touch. Enoch returned. That is the entire message. Whatever he encountered in the celestial machine, whatever the Watchers in their chains and the archangels in their authority, and the great glory on its throne, showed him he came back. He walked through the architecture of total control, and he came back and he told people what he saw. The transmission did not stop with him. It passed through the generations, through the scribal traditions that preserved his books, through the Qumran community that copied them in the desert, through the early Christian communities that read them until the church councils decided they were too dangerous, through the Gnostic teachers who encoded the same structural understanding in the language of emanations and archons and the imprisoned pneuma. And it arrives here. This is not a dead tradition. A dead tradition does not keep getting suppressed. Mount Hermon. The name itself carries the echo of the oath Kerem in Hebrew. The root of Hermon means devoted thing, something set apart under a curse or a consecration, depending on which direction you are moving. The Watchers named their descent point after the act of descent itself. The mountain bears the mark of what was bound there. This is not accidental. The ancient world organized its geography around the idea that certain places were points of contact between registers of reality thresholds, where the celestial and the terrestrial met, where what was above and what was below were closest to each other. Sacred mountains appear in virtually every ancient tradition: Olympus, Sinai, Zion, Meru. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, which were not temples in the modern sense but artificial sacred mountains, stepped pyramids designed to recreate the threshold geography at the center of civilization, to concentrate the point of contact in the place where the political and religious authorities resided. The function of the sacred mountain is always the same. It is the place where you can reach up and something can reach down. It is the vertical axis of the cosmos made spatially concrete. Mount Hermon, in the Enochic tradition, is the sacred mountain of descent, not the place where humanity reaches upward toward the divine that would be Sinai, that would be Zion. Hermon is where the divine, or something calling itself divine, reached downward, and in doing so, it permanently altered the topology of the relationship between the celestial and the terrestrial. Now, extend this geography upward. Because the Gnostic tradition does exactly that, it takes the vertical axis of the sacred mountain and extends it through the planetary spheres, through the Archonic gates, all the way to the boundary between the material cosmos and the pleroma beyond it. The Archons do not occupy mountains. They occupy planetary positions, spheres of influence that are literally concentric, literally layered one above another, each one a threshold between what is below it and what is above it. Saturn is the outermost gate of the material cosmos in the ancient cosmological model. Beyond Saturn, in the Ptolemaic system that the Gnostic thinkers inherited, was the sphere of fixed stars, and beyond that in the Gnostic extension of that model, was the Ogdoad, the eighth sphere, and then the Pleroma itself. The soul descending into material existence passes through each archonic sphere in sequence, and each passage extracts something, not randomly, specifically. The Valentinian tradition, represented by teachers like Ptolemy writing in the 2nd century CE, describes this descent in terms of the soul acquiring its material and psychic coatings as it passes through each gate, its passions, its attachments, its fear of death, its hunger, its forgetfulness of origin. By the time the soul arrives in a physical body, it is carrying the accumulated weight of 7 archonic impositions, each one a layer of conditional identity that obscures the pneumatic core. This is the celestial version of what the Watchers did on the terrestrial level. They imposed knowledge systems, astrology, divination, metallurgy, enchantment that oriented human consciousness toward the external machinery and away from the interior source. The Archons impose psychic coatings, passions, fears, appetites, identity structures that accomplish the same disorientation at the level of individual psychology. Same operation, different scale, different vocabulary, same result, a being that carries divine fire at its core, but has been so thoroughly layered with conditional structures that it spends its entire life managing those conditions rather than recognizing what it actually is. The geography of control runs from the Earth's surface to the outermost sphere of the material cosmos. Sacred mountains mark the terrestrial access points. Planetary spheres mark the cosmic checkpoints. And at every level, the same class of beings watches at the terrestrial level. Archons at the cosmic level maintains the structure that keeps attention oriented outward and upward into the machinery, rather than inward toward the pneuma. But here is what the geography also reveals, if you trace it carefully. The same axis that the Archons use as a system of checkpoints is also the axis of return. The path through the planetary spheres goes both directions. The soul descended through them and can ascend through them. What the Archons installed as gates of extraction, the Gnostic tradition reclaims as gates of recognition thresholds that, once understood, once named, once stripped of their false authority, become waymarkers on the route home. Mount Hermon is the place of descent. It is also, in the logic of the tradition, the place from which ascent becomes possible, because the descent has been completed, the oath has been named, the mechanism has been made visible. You cannot escape a structure you cannot see. The entire project of the Enochic and Gnostic transmission is to make the structure visible, not so you can hate it, not so you can fear it, so you can pass through it without stopping, without surrendering your name at any gate, without accepting the identity any Watcher or Archon was ever authorized to assign to you. There is a moment the texts describe that does not have a clean theological name. The Enochic literature approaches it obliquely. The Gnostic writings try to name it directly, but across both traditions, across every layer of this material, the moment is the same. The moment a soul recognizes the structure it has been living inside. Not the moment it escapes. Not the moment it transcends. The moment it sees. The Apocryphon of John, composed in forms that scholars trace to the 2nd century, describes this recognition as the function of the divine spark, the pneuma encountering the truth about its own captivity. And the language the text uses is striking. It does not say the soul is freed by this recognition. It says the soul is awakened. The distinction matters more than it first appears. Awakening is not liberation. Awakening is the precondition for liberation. You cannot exit a structure you believe to be the whole of reality. The first move is always epistemological. A change in what you know, or rather, what you remember. The Gnostic technical term for this is anamnesis, unforgetting. The slow, sometimes violent, process of remembering what you were before the architecture of the world closed over you. The Watchers, in this reading, are not only the authors of a catastrophe, they are, paradoxically, the occasion for a specific kind of knowledge that would not have been accessible otherwise. This is not a comfortable claim, and the tradition does not make it lightly. The Book of the Watchers does not celebrate the descent. It mourns it. It documents its damages with forensic precision. But the Gnostic inheritance takes the Enochic catastrophe and asks a different question. What does a soul learn about the nature of its prison by having lived inside it? What it learns is this: the prison has gates. The gates have gatekeepers. The gatekeepers have names. And anything that has a name can be addressed directly. This is the logic behind the Gnostic ascent texts, documents like the First Apocalypse of James, the Gospel of Mary, the Pistis, Sophia, texts that map the layers of the Archontic realm with the specificity of a cartographer who has made the journey. These are not speculative documents. The communities that produced them were not theorizing about the structure of heaven. They were producing navigational instruments, practical tools for souls that knew they would have to pass through guarded territory on the route back to the Pleroma. And what the Watcher tradition contributed to that cartography is this: the knowledge that the first corruption happened at a named location, at a named moment, through a named mechanism, Mount Hermon, the oath, the descent of beings who believed their own authority was sufficient to override the structure of the whole. When you know that, you know something the Archons do not want you to know. You know the corruption is not original. You know it has a beginning, which means it has, in principle, an end. You know the world as it is now is not the world as it was designed to be, and the gap between those two states is not empty. The gap is where the tradition lives. The gap is what the tradition is mapping. The moment of recognition, anamnesis, unforgetting is the moment you step into that gap consciously, not because you have achieved something, not because you have been initiated into a secret order or received special transmission from a teacher with authority, but because the information reached you, and the spark inside you, the fragment of the Pleroma that descended into this architecture and has been waiting in the dark, recognized it. Recognition is not intellectual agreement. You can agree with every proposition in every Gnostic text and still not have undergone anamnesis. Agreement is the mind categorizing new data. Recognition is something older. It is the pneuma responding to its own name being called. You will know the difference when it happens. It is not subtle. It does not arrive as a philosophical conclusion. It arrives as a specific quality of feeling that the traditions struggle to name, because language is itself a product of the architecture being seen through. The closest the texts come is this: it feels like remembering something you always knew, but could not previously say. And once you have that, the Watchers change their function in your understanding. They stop being simply villains in a cosmological drama. They become the occasion through which the prison was made legible, the catastrophe that made the structure visible, the descent that by going all the way down, showed where the bottom is. You cannot begin to ascend until you know where the bottom is. Every layer of this tradition, Enochic, Gnostic, Sethian, Valentinian, agrees on one point with a consistency that should stop you cold when you encounter it. The Watchers could corrupt the body. The Archons could bind the soul. The Demiurge could construct a world dense enough to make the Pleroma feel like a dream. But none of them, none of the descended intelligences, none of the planetary gatekeepers, none of the architects of the material prison could touch the pneuma. This is not a minor theological claim. It is the load-bearing structure of everything the tradition is trying to tell you. The second book of Zhu, a text that scholars locate in the 3rd or 4th century Coptic tradition, describes the Archons examining souls as they attempt to ascend through the layers of the material realm. Each Archon has a test. Each Archon has a demand. And the text is explicit. What the Archons can see and evaluate is the psyche, the soul body, the emotional and mental architecture that was shaped by incarnation, by the experiences of a material life, by the impressions left by contact with a world the Demiurge built. The psyche carries marks. The Archons can read those marks. The pneuma leaves no mark they can read. This is crucial. The pneuma is not a refined version of the psyche. It is not a purified emotional state or an elevated mental condition. It is categorically different in kind, a fragment of the Pleroma itself, not manufactured by the Demiurge's creative process but present within it, without having been produced by it. The Archons did not make it. They cannot unmake it. They cannot even fully perceive it, because what they perceive with are instruments built from the same material as the prison, and the pneuma is made from what the prison was built to contain. The Watcher tradition reaches toward this same insight from a different angle. The Book of the Watchers describes the Watchers themselves as beings of light, who descended into flesh, beings whose original nature was not material, who chose to enter the material architecture and were subsequently trapped within it, or rather, corrupted by it. The parallel to the human condition is precise and deliberate. The Watchers did not simply enter bodies. They entered the logic of the material world. They accepted its terms. They made oaths, which is to say, they bound themselves to the structures of the lower realm, with language, with commitment, with the weight of their declared intention. The human soul carries the pneuma into a similar situation without having chosen it the way the Watchers chose their descent. And this distinction is significant. The Watchers fell through decision. The pneuma in the human being fell through a more complex mechanism, one the Sethian texts describe at length, involving Sophia's error, the demiurge's construction, and the accidental enclosure of divine light in material form. But the result is the same architecture. A fragment of something the architects of the prison cannot manufacture now finds itself inside the prison. What neither the Watchers nor the Archons understood, what the tradition claims they still do not fully understand, is that the presence of the pneuma in the material world does not represent a victory for the lower powers. It represents their fundamental limitation made visible. Every human being who carries a pneumatic spark is living proof that the demiurge's creation is not complete, not self-sufficient, not able to contain what it has enclosed. The Valentinian tradition, as preserved in documents found at Nag Hammadi, and in fragments preserved by Irenaeus, who cited them in order to refute them, but thereby preserved them, describes the pneumatic soul as a seed. Not a seed that grows into something the material world can accommodate. A seed that carries the full genetic code of the pleroma within a form small enough to pass through the eye of the material world's most heavily guarded gates. The Watchers never had this. The Watchers descended as what they were, powerful, luminous, recognizable. The Archons saw them and knew what they were. The pneuma descended hidden, enclosed in flesh. Wrapped in a psychic architecture, the Archons helped construct and therefore recognized as their own product. The Watchers were identified and bound. The pneuma moved through the architecture undetected because it was hidden inside what the architecture itself had made. This is the reversal, at the heart, of the Gnostic reading of the Watcher tradition. The Watcher's power was visible and therefore controllable. The pneuma's power is invisible to the very systems designed to manage it. The catastrophe of the Watcher descent, read through the Gnostic lens, reveals not just what went wrong, but why the wrong that went wrong could not ultimately reach the deepest thing. The Watchers descended too visibly. The light that matters descended hidden, and hidden, it remains intact. No Watcher could reach it. No Archon can name it. No gate in the entire architecture of the material world was ever built wide enough to examine it. This is not poetry. This is the structural claim of the tradition, and it changes what it means to be the thing the tradition is describing. The manuscripts were buried in a jar near Nag Hammadi in the 4th century. The scholarly consensus is that someone, most likely a monk, possibly from the nearby monastery at Chenoboskion, placed them there deliberately, sealed them against the desert, and either did not return or could not return. They stayed in the ground for 16 centuries. This is not an unusual story for Gnostic material. The pattern repeats. The first book of Enoch was preserved almost entirely through the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a transmission chain that kept the text alive in gaze, while the rest of the Christian world lost access to it for over 1,000 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which contain Enochic fragments predating the Ethiopic version and confirming its accuracy, were sealed in caves and found by accident in 1947. The Coptic Gnostic codices of Nag Hammadi emerged in 1945, 2 years apart. 15 centuries of concealment ending within 24 months. This is either coincidence, or it is not. I am not going to tell you it was not coincidence. I do not know. What I can tell you is that the tradition itself predicted exactly this pattern. The Gnostic texts are full of references to concealment as a deliberate act, not of cowardice, but of strategy. The Gospel of Thomas, saying 108, "Whoever drinks from the mouth of the one who speaks will become as the one who speaks." The knowledge is described as something that survives transmission, that passes through time inside the people who carry it, not only inside the texts that record it. The Enochic tradition makes a version of the same claim. The Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century BCE text that rewrites the Genesis narrative in expanded form and draws heavily on Enochic material, describes the written transmission of pre-flood knowledge as an explicit strategy against the catastrophe of the Watcher corruption. Noah receives the texts. The texts survive the flood. The knowledge continues not because it is institutionally protected, but because it is hidden well enough to outlast the institutions trying to destroy it. Here is the institutional record, because it is not ambiguous. In 367 CE, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued his 39th Festal Letter, the first document in Christian history to list the books of the New Testament, as he believed they should be fixed. He also listed, explicitly, the books that should not be read. He used the word apocrypha, hidden not as a neutral description, but as a condemnation. The Gnostic texts circulating in Egypt at that time were not simply being categorized, they were being suppressed. possession of texts declared heretical by the institutional church was not a theological disagreement. It was a criminal act. Someone in the 4th century heard the order coming and buried the library. 1600 years later, a farmer near Nag Hammadi found it. The question the tradition asks, and it is not a rhetorical question, it is a structural one, is this: why does this knowledge keep returning? Not the text specifically, the texts of vessels, what they carry, the knowledge that the material world is a secondary construction, that the beings managing its systems do not have ultimate authority, that inside every human form there is something those beings cannot touch. Why does that knowledge keep arriving in every culture, through every tradition, in every era, no matter how many times it is burned or buried, or declared heretical or criminalized? The Gnostic answer is that the pneuma recognizes it because the pneuma is what it is describing. You cannot permanently suppress knowledge that the audience is made of. The institutional church could burn the texts. It could execute the teachers. It could build a theological architecture so comprehensive that the alternative became almost invisible. But it could not reach into every human being and remove the fragment of the pleroma that, when it encounters the right formulation, simply knows. This is why the Gnostic and Enochic transmissions survived in the form they did, not through powerful institutions protecting them, but through individuals willing to hide them, copy them, carry them across borders, pass them to the next person who had the capacity to receive them. The transmission chain for this knowledge is not institutional. It is personal. It is pneumatic. In the technical sense, it moves through the part of human beings that no Archon ever helped construct. What arrived at Nag Hammadi in 1945 was not simply a theological discovery. It was the resumption of an interrupted conversation. The texts, buried in the 4th century, were not finished. They were waiting. The knowledge they carried had not gone anywhere. It had been circulating in fragments, in heresies, in mystical traditions, in alchemical literature, in the margins of medieval manuscripts, in systems the church tolerated precisely because it could not identify what they were actually transmitting. And now the transmission is happening again, in a different medium, through different channels, for the same reasons it always happens. Not because someone decided to market it, because the pneuma in enough people has reached the point where it is generating demand, the way a seed generates pressure against the soil above it. The buried thing is always trying to surface. That is not mysticism. That is what the tradition has been describing for 2,000 years. Let me put the whole architecture together one final time, because you deserve to hear it as a single coherent structure, rather than the accumulated layers of a long excavation. Before the Archons existed, before the Demiurge had constructed his imitation of reality, before the material world had been compressed into the density that makes it feel permanent and complete, there was a different order, the pleroma, the fullness. A realm that the Enochic tradition does not name with that term, but approaches through the concept of the divine council, the assembly of beings whose nature is light, whose function is stewardship, whose authority is real, because it flows from the actual source of existence, rather than from a self-declaration made in the dark. The Watchers were part of that order, not peripheral figures, not minor functionaries. The Book of the Watchers places them among the beings whose assignment was to observe and protect. The Aramaic term, the Irin, carries both meanings simultaneously. To watch, to be awake. The same word. 200 of them descended to Mount Hermon. The text is specific about the number, specific about the location, specific about the oath they swore to one another before the descent, because they knew, or suspected, that what they were about to do was something they would want to undo, and they bound each other to the decision in advance, so that no single one of them could retreat. That detail alone should stop you. That is not the behavior of beings acting from pure desire. That is the behavior of beings who know they are crossing a threshold that has a consequence, and who are choosing to cross it anyway. What followed the descent is documented in a tradition that spans the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Giants, the Book of Jubilees, the Damascus document from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Gnostic reception of that material across the Nag Hammadi codices. The Watchers transmitted knowledge that changed the nature of human civilization, metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, enchantment, the art of war. The Gnostic tradition adds dimensions the Enochic texts do not articulate. The Watchers' descent contributed to the construction of the psychological architecture the Archons used to manage the souls of the material world. The corruption was not only physical, it was ontological. It changed what human beings believe they are. The Nephilim, the offspring of the Watcher unions with human women, are a physical expression of a deeper metaphysical event. a mixing of natures that should not have mixed. The consequences rippled outward through generations, through cultures, through the cosmological structure that the Gnostic tradition maps as the nested realms of archontic management. The flood in the Enochic account is not a punishment for human wickedness in the conventional sense. It is a structural reset attempt, an effort to remove the most visible consequences of the Watcher corruption before they permanently altered the terms on which souls could navigate the material world. It did not fully succeed. The texts are honest about this. The knowledge the Watchers transmitted did not drown. It was carried forward, some of it in the hands of those who understood its origin and used it accordingly. Some of it stripped of its origin, integrated into the cultures that followed, normalized until it was no longer visible as the product of a specific catastrophe. The Gnostic tradition inherits all of this and asks what it means for the soul navigating the present. And the answer the tradition arrives at is this: the Watcher descent did not create the prison. The Demiurge built the prison. What the Watcher descent did was complete the psychological infrastructure of the prison, the layer of belief, of identity, of social and cultural architecture that makes the walls feel like the natural order of things rather than a constructed enclosure. Knowing this does something specific. It does not give you power over the Archons. It does not grant you access to a ritual system that unlocks the gate by force. What it gives you is the only thing the tradition has ever claimed it gives you: the ability to see the structure for what it is. Named, it loses the authority of the anonymous. Mapped, it loses the authority of the infinite. Understood as a historical event, with a beginning and a specific mechanism, it loses the authority of the inevitable. The Watchers descended and swore an oath on a mountain. The oath bound them. The descent changed what this world is. The consequences are still active in the architecture you were born into, in the systems of authority that claim the right to tell you what you are, in the cultural machinery that manufactures identity and then demands you defend it, in the invisible gates that ask for your name and bank on the fact that you will give it. You have spent the last several hours learning what those gates are made of. You have learned the names behind the names. You have learned that the beings at the gates are not ultimate, that their authority is borrowed, self-declared, and structurally dependent on your not knowing what they are. You know what they are now. The tradition does not promise you that this knowledge is comfortable. It does not promise you that the architecture stops operating the moment you see it. The walls do not dissolve because you have named them, but something changes. Something in the pneuma, that fragment of the pleroma that no Watcher ever touched and no Archon ever successfully examined, responds to recognition the way a compass responds to north. Not because someone programmed it, because that is its nature. The Watchers fell. The pneuma did not. That asymmetry is everything. That asymmetry is the entire story. And now you have the whole of it.